Well, good afternoon, Lorraine Miller. With the Redistricting Task Force, I'd like to call our meeting to order on November 19th. Can you believe it's November? We're almost at Turkey Day. Right. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief because we got a lot of work to do today. And I really want to turn to Ms. Kayser with her QT. And she's going to explain what's in our packets today. Morning, people out in woo-woo land. Good to see all of you.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone, or afternoon, excuse me. For those of you that are here, in front of you, you have a packet of materials. You have the agenda, and then you have the presentations that staff will be providing to you during the meeting. You have some comments from Mr. Schur, which he provided on your redistricting criteria to perhaps jumpstart that conversation. And then we have some folks who have signed up to speak this afternoon. Some are here with us and others will be on the phone. And some of them have a presentation, so you have a copy of that. Not all of them do, but some of them do. And then at the very end of your packet, we have had a number of folks just provide us written comments, and so those are included as well. So you have all of that information there for you. So,
thank you, Ms. Kayser.
Right. And if you wouldn't mind if we could just go around the table and take roll real quick so I can make sure I don't miss anybody. That would be great.
I'll start here. Lorraine Miller.
Graham Norris. Tony DeVito.
Craig Allen.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
And
Bill
on the
Schur.
WebEx, Bill Schur.
Yes.
Ms. Kennedy.
Hello.
Williams.
Ms. Ayala.
Yes, this is Teresa. Hello.
Great. Mr. Williams is omnipresent. And who else?
Mr. Bradshaw just joined.
Mr. Bradshaw?
Yes.
There you are. Welcome.
Hi.
Great. So everybody received, Ms. Kayser, you good?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Good, thank you.
Everyone received the minutes from our October 22nd meeting, correct? Everybody on WebEx, you received the minutes also and you read them? Could I have a motion to approve the minutes? I'm sorry?
I'll make a motion to approve. This is
Any
Teresa.
second?
Y'all
Okay, great. Great. It's been properly moved in second. Unless you really want to vote, unanimous? Aye? Thank you. So our first presenter out of the chute will be our favorite person, Mr. Mark McAvoy. Mr. McAvoy is our Director of Planning and Data Analytics Department. Welcome, Mr. McAvoy, again.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Let me share my screen here, and you'll just need to tell me when you want to move your slides, and I'll move them for you.
Okay, sounds good. So, Madam Chair and task force members, thank you for having me back. Hopefully you received the maps that we sent out last week. That's what I'm primarily going to be talking from. And so if you have questions regarding those as we go through, don't hesitate to stop. But these are the general growth and demographics things that we are going to be discussing this afternoon. So Mary, if you can go to the next one for me. But just as a kind of a level setting exercise here, and this is a bit of a reminder from the previous presentation, for 2020, when the census numbers finally come in, we're expecting them to show a population in the city of Fort Worth of about 909,000, which is a 23% increase over the 2010 census. And as you look at those two pie charts to the right, you'll see a distribution based on race and age that shows how that 909,000 is estimated to be broken down in each of those categories. Are there any questions about this slide before we go on to the maps? Essentially, this is a summary of last presentation's information. Mary, next slide, please. Okay, this is a bit small to see on the screen, but you've got this in front of you, and this was in essence to provide more of a baseline with a map of the existing council districts as they are constituted today. And you can see there that we've got the road network, the major road network plotted, and some of the other municipalities surrounding and completely surrounded by the city of Fort Worth highlighted there. So it's a bit easier to tell where Fort Worth is as opposed to where some of the neighboring municipalities are. Next slide, please. This is a slide to show, and we showed this last time as well, but it was a bit unclear, and so we wanted to provide a more clear version of this. The 2018 population in each council district based on the U.S. Census American Community Survey estimates. And as you can see there, those population numbers total 850,000-ish, which was the population in 2018, and each district averaged about 106,000. And as you can see, the range of populations from high to low, which is explained by the growth between 2010 and 2018 that would have occurred in each of those council districts. Next slide, please. And so now what we're looking at is a projected population for 2020. And as you recall from the opening slide, the census estimate that we're expecting to see is about 909,000. And as you look at the projected population here in 2020, this is using a different data set. This is using a data set from the Council of Governments that is based on traffic survey zones, which are a unit of geography that's a bit different from a census tract. So I just wanted to point out that it's a little different in its methodology. But when we look at the projected populations in 2020, you'll see where the darker the green, the more concentrated the population in each of those zones. And what's a bit tricky about this is that each zone is not exactly the same size. And so you just have to kind of look at these as they're intended to be used, and really the value is going to become evident when we go to the next slide, Mary, and see the projected population for 2030 using the same methodology. So when you look between projected 2020 and projected 2030, you see as the green gets darker, those are the areas that we expect to continue to grow and to concentrate with more population. So that area right there in kind of the northwest quadrant, the area in the southwest quadrant, you can see getting darker greener as we go from 2020 to 2030. Next slide, please. Now we're going to look at a projected growth rate, which is essentially the data, the projected rate of that population growth between 2020 and 2030. And so if we're looking at those numbers as a rate, you can see again that the percentage growth is concentrated out west along the 2030 confluence there, out west in the Walsh Ranch area, down in the southwest area, up in the north off of 35 there, and some other pockets throughout on major transportation corridors. Next slide, please. Now when we compare that to the population growth rate of 2010 through 2018, the difference here is that we're using projections looking out into the future, comparing them to actuals looking back into the past. The growth rate from 2010 to 2018, which is based on census data, and so the census tract is the unit of geography that we're using here, which is a bit different than the zone that we looked at earlier in the projection. The outcome is really no different. You see those pockets of concentrated growth in the same general areas. The only difference is now out east, if you look in that extreme east area. You see some pretty concentrated growth there. And again, in a repeated fashion of what we expect to see, or not in a repeated fashion, in a preceding fashion of what we expect to see 2020 to 2030, north, west, and southwest as well. Next slide, please. And then I wanted to also just kind of give you some context here. We had this slide in our last packet as well, but just looking at the super majority minority areas with 2020 data, again, this is census data. If you look at those areas that are shaded in blue shade going from lighter to darker, which indicates a higher concentration of majority minority areas, you see where they are placed in the city around the transportation corridors there. And as we're looking kind of in the near northwest and the near southeast and south of the city, you see the higher concentrations there as indicated by the darker blue. And I believe that's the last slide that we have. And so I would welcome any questions and be glad to discuss any of them that you have.
Anybody have any questions? Mr. Sure?
Oh, yeah, well, I did have a question. These particular maps showing the growth rates, do we contemplate using these to make adjustments to districts, or are we thinking that we should basically use this data to in setting the initial boundaries as opposed to adjusting? That may be a premature question, but that's it.
I don't think that I can answer that question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Let me see if I can give it a try. This is Fernando, Costa. I would say that it would be beyond the scope of this task force to draw any redistricting maps. The task force is charged with recommending criteria and procedures, and we want you to be sufficiently familiar with the process that we follow to redraw maps so that you can gain a better appreciation for those criteria and procedures. But beyond understanding the process and perhaps even the technology that we use, the software for drawing council district maps, we're not asking the task force actually to produce those maps. This is for your general awareness about growth trends. I believe task force members actually posed questions to us last time about what are the trends. And that's what Mr. McAvoy has been seeking to present. And you're certainly at liberty to test your criteria using whatever data are currently available, even though those are not the same data that we'll be using eventually after the 2020 census results are available. Nevertheless, you can use currently available data if you wish, and the appropriate software to draw some sample maps and gauge whether the criteria you're considering are producing the results that you expect.
Great.
And so that's a good, productive exercise, but you will not be recommending any formal maps, if that distinction makes sense.
Mr. Espino?
Fernando, and the council has to use census data, not estimates, not projections. It
Yes,
has
sir.
to use the actual census data, which will be available, I guess, to the country.
August of 2021.
So then, only then can the maps.
Only then.
Only then. So we're looking at August of 2021. And then if I'm clear, this will be after the May municipal election. So the next election that these, with that 10-1 and this census data, it'll be in 2023, right?
Yes, sir, exactly right.
Thank you.
So an analogy would be in baseball terms, this is spring training. The spring training games don't count toward the record book, but it gives you valuable practice.
Sports analogies are always helpful to the sports fans. Go Rangers.
Yeah, they are. This is Teresa Ayala. I have a question, please.
Sure.
So thank you for that clarification, and thank you for that question, Mr. Spino. So if you could just kind of tell us, so that way, as we're developing this criteria, Mr. Costa, how would the council or whoever's going to establish these boundaries, how would they be able to utilize this data at the appropriate time? Can you kind of describe that? Basically, would they be using the same tools, kind of using this information, using the software and doing the same thing, or would they
They'll be using the same software.
Concept.
Yes, ma'am. They'll be using the same software that will be available to this task force.
Okay.
They will be using the actual census data
At the
once
time.
those data become available in 2021. We don't have access to those data yet, and therefore, the best we can do is rely upon existing estimates.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I was clear on that, because that's what I thought you were saying. I wanted to make
Yes,
sure.
ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Once we get the actual data, Mr. McAvoy, you will be doing similar maps like this for the council?
We certainly can. We would have that ability. I don't know that we've thought that far into the future about what our role then would be, but we certainly are in a position to be able to do that, yes.
This is Linda Kennedy, and all of that's going to happen way past when this task force has adjourned our work.
I would say yes, but
But, yes.
Miss Miller, on your behalf, and you've heard Mayor Price from your first meeting pledge that the council would hold a joint work session with this task force after the task force has formally completed its work and has been formally dissolved, but nevertheless would meet with the task force members so that you might ensure that they have a complete understanding of your expectations, and so that you might hold their feet to the fire, if you will, and even explore the possibility of including you somehow in the redistricting process. But your formal charge is merely to recommend the criteria and procedures that they should follow.
And I would hope, task force members, that we would follow on with kind of what Mrs. Kennedy was alluding to. This has become, the demographic material has become such a cost celeb for our task force that I would hope that the council would want to have the data, not only just this data, but as the actual data that they're going to receive from the Census Bureau becomes public, that they would want it broken out in a way that they can easily see where the growth areas are. That's our purpose here. And I would hope, and maybe that's something we want to include in our procedures.
Absolutely.
Yes, Ms. Miller, that was going to be my question as well when Ms. Kennedy brought it up. This is Teresa Ayala, as whether or not that could be a consideration that we think about, because it's obviously been helpful to kind of see the trends, and it may be helpful for them as well.
Great. Ms. Kennedy, you concur?
I do. And I have another question for Mr. McAvoy.
Good.
Is there, I love your maps. I really enjoy data. Is there a way to see the projections? I know we can't, our next districts will look completely different because we're going to have more districts. But could we look and see if we had the exact same districts we have now, what they would look like based on the population projections that are in here for the next decade that you have?
So to clarify the question, using the existing council boundaries with the projected population, what those populations would look like?
Yes, sir.
yes, we can produce those, absolutely.
Thank you. I think that would be helpful, just to kind of understand a little bit better. For me, I need to see like actual numbers. It's just how my brain works. I'm sorry.
Right. Good. Mr. Shure? You're on mute, Mr. Shure, I think.
Yeah, these particular maps, I take it, are at some point could be made into expandable images or PDFs like other GIS maps where we could actually get more detail. Is that something that can be done? So if I wanted to zero in on these specific areas that are dark highlighted, could I expand the map to see what streets are actually in areas these actually encompass?
So the answer to that question and any other scalable question is yes. The data that we have available, we can put in any presentable scale that you want to see. The challenge with producing a map that fits on a sheet of paper that we send out so that you can look at with the dimensions of Fort Worth is that, it's long and kind of wide. But yes, we can scale it to have whatever view you would like to see and with whatever data that is available to layer onto those maps, yes.
I guess my question is could these maps be made available like other GIS maps, not necessarily in paper form, but in an electronic version that we could sit at our computers and use dynamic zoom or marquee zoom or whatever else to see what these areas really are? Is that, I don't know if there's some legal problem with making it available in that form or not, but it would be much more meaningful to me to be able to really zero in and say, now I see what these areas are. And I know that that's not something that we're going to be drawing these maps, but just to get a better idea in general what these areas are.
I believe the city already has a GIS service established, but I'm going to invite Michelle Swindle from IT to come up and address that specifically. And so she's on her way up to the podium here. Give her a second.
While she's on her way to the podium, I'll just share, maybe it's not, they don't have it in paper form. Is that true? Yes, they do. Oh, they do? No, I'm sorry, they have electronic. Okay, so it's not very difficult at all, not in an exact scientific way, but if you take the current slide that was like our fourth or fifth, the one population by council district, where it has all the districts, and you just kind of flip back and forth onto the majority minority areas, it's pretty easy to see where they all fall right now. Just so you know, I'm just flipping back and forth, and it's not that hard to look at.
So the technical answer to the question is yes, we can.
Michelle, can you get right up on top of that microphone?
Sorry. The technical answer is yes, we can create an interactive web map that you can go through and compare, turn multiple ones on, and change the transparency. But the question is security and privileges. We can lock it down for everyone who's a member of this task force if there is sensitive information that we don't want made public, but if it's public information, we can publish that out. So that's at the discretion of the task force.
Ms. Scott?
So I'm familiar with the big maps that are produced if someone's running for council. And those maps, can that be given to us? It's actually paper and it's, huge, but it might be able to drill down and show the lines of the streets in the different areas, but it would be paper and not electronic. Is that possible?
We do have a plotter that we can print that out, yes, if that's beneficial.
For me, my question is, do we want to use this data that Mr. McAvoy has, or do we want to wait until we get the actual figures in August? Because this would kind of be a futile exercise. Mr. McAvoy, you have an opinion one way or the other?
So our charge was to provide you with some data that could help make criteria decisions. When the actual census data is produced, you will be out of the realm of
Yeah.
dealing with estimates and now dealing with actual data, which will make it much easier at that point, so.
Okay. I just threw it out there.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Mr. Espino?
I mean, we can play with the current data because, I mean, as was alluded to earlier, you can tell the population trends and the growth trends, right? North of the loop, out west, southwest, you know, and then you see the majority minority areas. You can play with the data now and get an idea. I mean, yeah, the census data will be accurate and that's the data that has to be used, but you can play with the data now and kind of get a good idea, as was said earlier, about what this is going to look like. But,
Yeah.
you know, that's up to the task
Yeah.
force and the council. Obviously, the council has to use census data for the redistricting.
Mr. DeVito?
When might we have access to the software, the computer program that allows us to manipulate lines and district lines and so forth?
Well, we had a briefing on it, but if most of you were like me, that was, ugh, I mean, because it was at the end of the day. And maybe that is something, Mr. Costa or whoever.
I wonder if Ms. Swindle or Mr. Flatiger, I don't know, we're acquiring the rights to use that software.
Yeah, so that is in the process of being procured. It's not been finalized, but we expect for that to be done imminently. So that's on its way, yes.
So, but we need to see that pretty quickly, though. So it's imminent, but it's not quite there yet. Do you have a projection of when it might be? Because this is going to,
Do we have an estimate that we can comfortably?
Last from Annabelle was it was going through DIR.
Yeah, it's completely in the process internally within the city.
could he come to the mic? Because I want everybody, all the task force members to hear the response.
My name is Eric Flanagan with Planning and Data Analytics, and the answer to the question is that the process of procuring that software is in the midst of running through the internal systems in order to get acquired. So we're actually quite close to that being done, but we don't have a specific date yet that we'll have it and be able to use it.
So, Eric, can we expect that by January 1st, we'll have access to the software?
Yes, I think that would be certainly doable.
So we certainly want to use it during our community forums, right, Mr. DeVito? Is that?
Absolutely. It will eliminate so many of the paper map and the discussions and just different trackings that we're trying to do with paper maps and layers when you have the ability to do that all within the computer program. It's going to save this guy a lot of work for sure, but it's going to give us much better data. And then once the new census data comes in and plugs in, we can, if we're so moved to create
Yes.
a map of our.
No, we would encourage residents of Fort Worth to use that software, and the software will be widely available to them.
HOAs,
Exactly.
community groups, things like that.
Any
then
interested
they'll be
group.
able to produce more accurate maps.
So could we have it as kind of our 101 briefing, kind of a
Yes,
teaser
ma'am, we
to
could
people?
include it in the
Okay.
Redistricting 101 seminar, information about access to the software.
Great. Super duper. Any more questions? Mr. Shore? We can't hear you.
Miss-
There you go.
Well, just to close out my question, with these maps that we have in the current presentation, if you could add one layer, namely street names, on a map that we could access online in Zoom, that would be very meaningful to me. I don't know about the rest of the members, but that is what I would like to see.
Mr. McAvoy, can you do that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. One last question. I noticed on the maps you have, at the legend at the bottom says county boundary, city limits? Okay. So looking at those that are supposedly outside the county boundary, those areas, like at I-20, up at the top, where it says 35W. These are still areas that are going to be part of what we're working with, correct? I just want to make sure.
Yes, so anything that would be inside of the city limit of Fort Worth, regardless of which county it rests in, would be part of, yes.
The redistrict.
Yes.
Okay, I looked at that and I said, oh, okay. Any other questions? Great, thank you, Mr. McAvoy.
You bet, thank you.
Chair
Wait a minute.
Miller,
Yeah.
I do have a quick question. This is Teresa Ayala.
Yes, Ms. Ayala.
Yes, Mr. McAvoy, this has been very helpful information. I just have a question for you since I am not a demographer. Is there anything else that you think that would be helpful for us to see that may not be reflected here in the data you provided?
That's to Mr. McAvoy?
Yes.
Yes.
With respect to the task in front of the task force, I'm not a demographer either, and so I don't think so. I think the goal that we were trying to achieve with this information was showing the actual growth and then projecting growth out into 2030 so that you as a task force could see where the experts were projecting that growth to occur.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. McAvoy, I just want to say.
Hello.
Yes. Who's speaking?
This is Bert Williams. I'm just trying to
great.
ask a question too.
Sure,
Okay,
Mr.
can you hear me now?
Williams. Go ahead, sir.
Now, I would like to know this. Since it seems like that from what I just heard a while ago, we are looking at not getting the information for the census data until August of next year. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's correct.
That is correct. I guess the next thing I'd like to know, I'd like to make sure that we know all of the territory that is in the boundaries of the city of Fort Worth that's in process now that we don't have already. What about the land that is supposedly at the present time being looked at as far as bringing into the city of Fort Worth? Do we have a list of all of that property, or do we have any property like that?
The city annexes property from time to time. More often than not, the property being annexed consists of what we call enclaves, areas that are completely surrounded by the city of Fort Worth or other municipalities, little donut holes. But from time to time, we'll annex property on the periphery, and all of that property will be subject to being included within one council district or another. So even though 99% of the future geography is already within the city of Fort Worth, it is possible that we will be annexing some property between now and August of 2021 when we actually begin drawing the council district maps.
Well, that to me would be very interesting. I think it would be something that we would need to have. And I guess the thing that I was just listening to all of this, and it seemed like to me that what we ought to do is to set up the criteria for the selection. And one of the things that we also are looking at is that we're talking about 10 districts rather than the 8 that we have now, which means that the population, of course, is going to change. I think it's already been projected. So I guess the thing that I'm concerned about is just the fairness of the lines that are going to be drawn for each one of the council districts. And I think that that really is going to be mostly determined by the population that we, in the census that we're going to get next August, which means that it's really kind of be hard to draw any council districts prior to that, but I know we can. I think the criteria is what they're wanting us to set up. And I'm hoping, and when you look at these different maps, you can see where the concentration of the population is going. You can also see from the maps that was shown earlier about the population and about the different ethnic groups in regards to the amount of the population that each one ascertains in the city of Fort Worth, which means that we're going to I think the criteria is going to be one of the basic thing is the line drawing and being able to get the census, and then only when we get the census will I think we'll be able to really draw the lines and draw the lines effectively because of how the population is divided or scattered or how it is impacted in certain areas, which means that the area, as far as the land itself, it may not be the same, but we'll to look at the population and base it on the numbers of people of the population. So it's to me, it's going to be kind of hard for us to really even think about drawing in a line until we really get those numbers so that we can make sure that it is fair in regards to the numbers that you have in each one of the districts. I'm hoping that that's what we're looking at. It's trying to make sure that each one of the districts will have pretty close within a range, you know, maybe 2 or 3%, that each one will have the same number of people rather than we talk about other things. But I'm just looking at that, and I'm just hoping that we're really looking at it from the point of trying to make sure that within the boundaries we have the council person dealing with the same number of people or pretty close to it.
Mr. Costa.
I think a lot of this information, Mr. Williams, thank you for those observations. I think a lot of this information will begin to make more sense after we give you the next presentation, which will focus more on the criteria and how we apply them. And then I think we'll be able to answer a lot of the questions you're trying to ask now. I would say in reference to the data and the projections that Mr. McAvoy has just shared with you, those are relevant in the sense that once we get the final 2020 census results in August of next year, and the data tell us that the population of Fort Worth is somewhere in the ballpark of 900,000. I think the figure Mr. McAvoy gave us a little over that, 909,000. But let's say, to use ballpark terms, 900,000. And let's say one of our criteria is that the population shall not be more or less than 5% of the average. Exactly. A deviation shall not exceed 5% in either direction. So if we have 900,000 population in 10 districts, the average population of each district would be 90,000. 5%, if I figure it correctly, is 4,500. So those council districts with slow-growing populations, you probably want to set at 94.5, no more than 94,500 population, because they're not going to grow very fast. But the rapidly growing council districts, you probably want to set at 90,000 minus 4,500, or 86, 85.5, because you know those are going to grow. And so the fastest growing districts would have a population of roughly 9,000 less than the slowest growing districts, but after 10 years, you can reasonably expect that those rapidly growing districts will have greater populations than the districts that started with a greater number. So that's a direct application of these population projections to the work that the city council will be doing when they begin to redraw the council district maps. They want to take those trends into, those projections into account when they set the district boundaries. But you'll see as we talk more about the criteria that we're going to have many different criteria, and sometimes it'll be almost impossible to meet all the criteria simultaneously to the ultimate degree. You're going to have to make some compromises. Once people start redrawing maps, what they intuitively think is going to be a simple process becomes very complex. And it's going to be virtually impossible to check all the boxes as having been fully met to everybody's expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Committee task force members, are there any other questions? Anybody else have anything that they want to say about the demographics? Well, committee, if you allow me to say to Mr. McAvoy, we appreciate everything you do. We wish that we could provide you hazardous pay because I hope you feel loved and needed because we need you, and we appreciate your willingness to come forth and provide us maps and explanations because you're the resident expert in the room, but we thank you.
I appreciate it. And I also want to say that two gentlemen sitting over here, Zach Hutchinson and Eric Flatiger, are the ones that you ought to be thanking directly. They're the ones who are pulling all this information together. Raise your hands, guys.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
hi, guys.
I'm just telling you about them, right? So these are the guys that make the magic happen.
Well, we appreciate you, all of you, for the work you're doing, and I know it goes up beyond the call of duty, but I think our residents in Fort Worth, you're making a contribution that we all appreciate, and thank you both.
Thank you.
Okay. Now we're come to the our presentation from Mr. Costa about our preliminary findings of the task force, and we really need to focus in on this one because this is real meat of what we're trying to get to today.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Costa.
Exactly right. And as a reminder, on Tuesday, December 1st, Chairwoman Miller, on your behalf, and you're all welcome to participate, is scheduled to brief the Fort Worth City Council on the preliminary findings of the redistricting task force.
Mr. Costa,
Yes,
may
ma'am.
I just say to the task force, I hope you guys would not leave me out there by myself, that some of you would come and, because this is a task force activity, not a one-woman show, even though I am cute, but it is all of us involved in this. Right, Mr. Speedo?
Absolutely.
Ayala, Ms. Kennedy, Mr. Shore, all of us, and of course, Mr. Williams. We're all involved in this, okay? Sorry for the
Thank you, ma'am. No.
digression.
Thank you very much. So in anticipation of your interim report to the City Council on December 1st, we'd like this afternoon to summarize for you some of the information that we had presented to you in previous meetings, and summarize as well what we have heard to be your comments on some of the draft criteria to see whether we've captured your comments reliably. And most important this afternoon, we'd like to engage you in a discussion so that we can try to capture a consensus from this task force about the draft criteria. They're still in draft form, that we would share with the council and subsequently share with the community when we have the seminar, Redistricting 101, and a series of public meetings, which we'll also want to be discussing later in this meeting, with the city residents and get their comments. So I think the idea that Ms. Miller wanted to advance was that rather than going to the public with a blank slate and saying, please tell us what you want, it might be more productive to go out with a draft set of criteria and have people comment on them, say, no, well, we like this and we don't like that, or you missed this point, and then you can fine tune it based on what you hear. We think that would probably be a lot more effective than simply asking people what they want without any context for their comments. So, if I may, we would remind the city council about the folks that they have appointed to this redistricting task force, please. And remind them about the process that you have followed. The council appointed you back in August. You held your first meeting in September. And you'll recall the series of briefings that we provided to you in the course of a fairly long meeting. And then another lengthy meeting in October, in which you heard from representatives of two other cities, Austin and San Antonio, about their redistricting criteria and procedures. We also presented you with information about the Voting Rights Act and local demographic trends. And then today, where you'll be discussing your preliminary findings and then giving your interim report to the council next month, please. And then you'll be able to provide them with a brief history of redistricting, particularly since the last census, some of the significant events that have occurred, and of most direct relevance, the recommendation by the city manager in the wake of the report from the Task Force on Race and Culture that the council focused on criteria and procedures as the basis for work to be performed by this task force on redistricting. And then the council, of course, appointed the task force earlier this year. Yes, please. And then to summarize some of the local demographic trends as they pertain specifically to redistricting, our population has been growing rapidly, and as Mr. McAvoy was explaining, will continue to do so. Fort Worth, for the last 20 years or so, has been one of the fastest growing big cities in the country, one of the 3 or 4 fastest growing big cities in the country, and we have every expectation that that trend will continue. There are parts of Fort Worth that are growing faster than other parts. Far north Fort Worth, north of Loop 820, on balance has been the fastest growing part of the city for the last 20 years. But there are other parts of Fort Worth that are growing rapidly as well. Walsh Ranch in the far west has been growing and will be growing at a greater rate. Far southwest Fort Worth, around the new Tarleton State Campus, has been growing rapidly. So you'll see pockets of growth in different parts of Fort Worth, but to generalize, the far north sector, north of Loop 820, has been the fastest growing, and many of the redistricting challenges will be associated with how we configure council districts to represent residents of far north Fort Worth. Hispanics represent the fastest growing demographic group in Fort Worth, even though their proportion of voting age population, voter registration rates, and voter participation rates tend to be relatively low. Nevertheless, when you undertake redistricting, you're doing it on the basis of total population, not on registered voters, not on voting age population. You base it on the actual total population, which includes all residents, not exclusively citizens of the United States, but all residents, even immigrants who are not citizens require representation by the City Council and are included in the population data. Finally, African American and Hispanic populations are less concentrated and more widely dispersed today than they have been ever before in Fort Worth's history. Historically, through periods of segregation, we saw that minority groups were highly concentrated, not necessarily by choice, but because they had no choice. They were relegated to those neighborhoods. Now that people have the legal right to live wherever they choose, we see that some choose to live in concentrations, but others are more widely scattered. So it becomes, in a sense, more challenging to create what we might call opportunity districts, where one population group or another obviously represents a clear majority. So more difficult to create those opportunity districts, but also more difficult to dilute minority voting strength through what are commonly called packing and cracking techniques. So we'll have a much more widely dispersed, more diverse population in all parts of Fort Worth. Next slide, please. And so just by way of a recap, these are the 2011 redistricting criteria, the criteria the council established after the 2010 census for use in creating the 2012 district map. And we wanted to use these 2011 redistricting criteria as a starting point for developing a new set of criteria to use after the 2020 census. Yes, please. And here's where we attempted to capture your comments. And in some cases, we heard loud and clear, this is what you want. In other cases, we did not hear a clear consensus. And so we'll want to discuss those topics at greater length this afternoon. So if I could run through these criteria with you. The first one is about districts of approximately equal size, with the largest district not exceeding 10% more than the smallest district in population. That is essentially a legal requirement under the law, one person, one vote. So we really don't have a lot of discretion as to whether or not we want to include it. Now, we may want to tighten the deviation, but this is a basic criterion for any community to use in redistricting. Second, the criterion was no fragmentation of minority communities or packing of minority voters. And what we heard from you is you wanted to retain this criterion in some form, but perhaps establish objective standards, well, what we mean by packing and cracking. Right now, we have a broad criterion, but we might want to establish more objective criteria. What exactly do we mean by that? And we'll talk about that in a moment. So we'd like to explore that further. And by the way, please stop me at any point if I say, we heard you tell us something and you didn't really mean to tell us that, because we don't want to be presumptuous. Number three, no retrogression in the ability of minorities to participate in the electoral process. Now that is a direct outgrowth of the Voting Rights Act as it stood after the 2010 census. It no longer is part of the Voting Rights Act. What we heard the task force say, and again, this is our inference, is that you want to retain that criterion, even though it's no longer a legal requirement that you do so. And if you see it differently, obviously you'll want to say so. But for now, we expect that you'll want to keep this criterion number three in some appropriate form. Number four is about compactness and contiguity of territory. Again, this is a common criterion among cities. But one of the comments that we heard from task force members and from members of the public was that we might want to have some objective standard for compactness. Compactness is something that we can all understand or appreciate in the abstract, but what exactly do we mean by compactness? And so we'd like to share with you a mathematical formula that we could apply if we wanted to use compactness as a criterion. Now, some will tell us that compactness is good to have, but it's not as important as other criteria. And so if that's the case, you may want to tell us. One of the things we haven't done and that we didn't do in 2011 is we did not assign priority to the different criteria. And we don't have to. All 11 or whatever number, or 10 criteria, however number we have, can be of equal weight. On the other hand, sometimes these criteria will come into conflict with each other, and you may want to know which of the criteria are more important than the others, in which case you could set priorities. But for now, we have not assigned any priority to any of the criteria beyond saying that the first one, equal size, is pretty much a given. Other than that, they're all roughly equally weighted. If you think some are more important than the others, we'd like to hear that, and you might want to make that part of your formal recommendations, if not in the preliminary findings, at least in your final report. So, compactness and how we measure that quality. Then we have identifiable geographic boundaries. I think you probably want to retain that. You want districts to be bounded by things you can see on the ground. It might be a river or some waterway. It might be railroad tracks. It might be an interstate highway. Something that is obviously visible on the ground that represents an obvious boundary. Containing communities of interest in single districts. I think we can probably agree on that. That's a common redistricting criterion, but we might want to have a precise definition of communities of interest so that we all know exactly what we mean by that term. Now, criterion number 7 was one on which we did not hear a clear consensus. Now, some people spoke for, some spoke against, but the question is, should we include areas inside Loop 820 and areas outside the loop, if possible, within each council district? That's been a traditional criterion in Fort Worth, probably more difficult to meet in the next round of redistricting because we're going to have 10 districts instead of 8, and because so much of the growth will have occurred outside of Loop 820. Nevertheless, some would say there's an argument to be made for retaining the philosophy that we should have districts that resemble pie slices stemming from the center of the city, the hub and spoke system, if you will, so that we don't have an us versus them relationship between those council members representing the central city and those representing the periphery. Everybody has a little bit of both, with certain exceptions, because the geography makes it almost impossible for all council districts to be in and outside of the loop. So that's a big question. So we put retain or delete. We don't know what you want, and we would encourage you to have discussion about that question today and give us the benefit of your guidance. Criteria number 8, containing whole voting precincts. I think you want to retain that. Number 9, containing whole census blocks or block groups within individual districts. I think you probably want to retain that criterion. And then number 10, I don't think we heard a definite consensus, but you may very well reach one this afternoon about whether we want to retain the criterion of preserving incumbent constituent relations. That has to do with whether you take into account where the incumbent council member lives and use that as a basis for drawing council districts. Another way of looking at it, and you'll see this in San Antonio, for example, and other communities, they'll say we want to begin, our starting point for redrawing the lines is the existing districts. We will reshape the existing districts, but we won't start from scratch. In other communities, they'll say, no, we're going to start from scratch. We won't take the existing districts into account. So those are two different philosophies of redistricting. Start with what you got and modify it, or start from scratch without any reference to what you currently have. So we would welcome your thoughts on that question as well after we complete this presentation. Yes, please. Okay, so without getting too deeply into the weeds, we wanted to address the question of what do we mean by packing and cracking? And here's an example. I think Ms. Guzman shared with you this slide, or something very similar to it, in her presentation about the Voting Rights Act. And here, in this diagram, the purple figures represent minority population, or persons of color, if you will. And they represent a community with 60% persons of color. Well, if you remember the data that Mr. McAvoy shared with us, Fort Worth is a community with roughly 60% persons of color, probably a little more than that. And so this is a community that looks very much like Fort Worth. And so if voting patterns were to follow racial and ethnic lines, which they don't always do, but sometimes they do, but if they do, if people vote for people who look like them, if you will, then you would expect that minorities would elect 60% representation on their elected body. But through packing and cracking, you can create a situation in which they only have 40% representation. And you can see on the left side of the screen, you have 3 cracked districts. That is to say that the green population outnumbers the pink population by a narrow margin, because the districts are very carefully crafted to create slight majority green populations within each district. Whereas on the right, you see 2 packed districts where you have a disproportionate concentration of those minority voters, of those persons of color, so that you end up with 3 green districts and only 2 purple districts, whereas the purple vastly outnumber the green. How can that happen? Well, that's what can happen when you do packing and cracking, either packing or cracking or some combination. So I think you want to prevent that, and you want to establish some standards that are enforceable to prevent packing and cracking if you agree that this is an undesirable practice that tends to dilute minority voting strength. It gets a little confusing when we're talking about minorities when they actually represent, in combination, a majority of the population. So at some point, we might want to use terms like persons of color, but traditionally, the term minority is used because persons of color in the United States represent a minority of the overall population. Okay, so let's take a look at what we mean by packing and cracking. In reference to the existing council districts. So here you can see on this map, in the yellow, you see the council districts 3, 4, and 7, where the combined minority population, the combination of all Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, et cetera, is less than 50%. These are majority white districts. They're shown in the yellow here. Those are districts 3, 4, and 7. There are 3 other districts, districts 5, 6, and 8, where the combination of minority populations represent more than 50% of the population. And those would be called minority opportunity districts. There's a clear opportunity for a minority to get elected if people vote along racial and ethnic lines. Again, that's a big if, but historically there has been a certain correlation between the demographic characteristics of the voter and the characteristics of the persons they elect to represent them. And finally, in the orange, districts 2 and 9, you see 2 Hispanic, specifically Hispanic opportunity districts, where Hispanics alone represent more than 50% of the population of districts 2 and 9. So those are the 2 Hispanic opportunities. Mr. Espino, yes, sir.
But that doesn't, when you say Hispanic population, that is not Hispanic citizen voting age population.
Exactly right. Okay. That's total population, whether they're voting age or not, whether they're registered or not, whether they're even citizens or not.
All right, thank you.
And so you could have a 60% Hispanic district where the actual percentage of Hispanic voters, it's much less than 50%. So that having what's called a minority or Hispanic opportunity district by no means guarantees that even if people vote along racial and ethnic lines, even if they do, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they'll be represented by somebody of that background. But that's an important point. Thank you, Mr. Espino, for clarifying that point. Okay, so this is in reference to the packing and cracking criteria. Yes, please. And so this is just a tabular depiction of the same data. So if you want to see the actual numbers underlying the minority concentrations in each council district, you can see the data on this table. Next, please. Okay, then the difficult issue of compactness. Hypothetically, a mathematician would tell you that the most compact shape you can have is a perfect circle. And so under this equation, the Polsby-Popper ratio is defined as 4 times the number pi times the area of the district being created, divided by the perimeter of that district squared. what that tells you is that if you had a perfectly compact district, a perfect circle, you would get a number 1. That would be the ratio. That would be the compactness score. Now, in reality, you'll never have a number 1. You'll never have anything really close to a number 1. But you want to get as high as you can. And here are some geometric shapes with different compactness scores associated with them. Now, incredibly enough, even if you look at the shape on the far right, as irregular as it may be, we have council districts that are even more irregular than that shape, that have even lower compactness scores. In large part, that is a direct and unavoidable function of the city's geography. Since we have annexed property in a piecemeal manner over many years, the perimeter of Fort Worth, the outline of the city, is highly irregular and jagged. And therefore, it's almost impossible to have compact districts that have the western boundary of the city representing the boundary of the district. And let me show you the next slide, please. Here you can see the actual compactness scores of our current city council districts. And you can see that they're very low scores. In fact, even the most compact district that we have today, Council District 9 in the interior of the city, because it's easier to draw compact districts in the interior than it is on the periphery where you have those jagged edges. Even in District 9, you have a compactness score below 0.2. So nowhere close to the maximum hypothetical score of 1. And then if you get down to districts 7 and 3, you have compactness scores below 0.05. So they're very low scores. And so you may or may not want to use this formula. You may or may not want to have any objective criteria at all. You may just want to say, make it as compact as you can, don't leapfrog over other districts, and just make it subjective. But if you wanted to make it objective, these compactness scores would give you the basis upon which you could do so. Next slide, please. Communities of interest, you'll find as many definitions as there are communities that adopt this criterion. But a good definition, I think, is one that we found from New York State. A local population with shared socioeconomic characteristics and political institutions that would benefit from unified representation. You could reword it in any number of ways, but this is basically what we mean by a community of interest, where you have folks with common characteristics and institutions that would benefit from common representation. Next slide, please. And just a brief recap of what you heard from Austin and San Antonio. From Austin, in respect to criteria, most of they use 8 criteria after the 2010 census. None of these cities, by the way, have established their 2020 criteria yet. We're actually, Fort Worth is ahead of most cities in using a task force to recommend new criteria. But going back to the last round of redistricting, these are the criteria in Austin, and the first 7 you'll find in most cities in one form or another. But number 8 is a little different because they say do not consider place of residence of incumbents or potential candidates in redrawing council district lines. So that was Austin. Next slide, please. If you look at San Antonio, most of their criteria were virtually consistent with those in Austin and Fort Worth, except the same highlighted criteria. Numbers 5 and 6. In San Antonio, it says base a plan upon existing districts. Remember, we were saying a little while ago, one approach is to take the existing districts and just modify them on the edges. That's what San Antonio did. And they also said keep incumbents in their districts. So they wanted to emphasize the criterion of incumbent constituent relations, unlike Austin, which said, no, don't consider that at all. So that's a key question for the task force to discuss today. Next slide, please. And finally, wanted to share with you criteria from another state, from Sacramento, California. They went through a rigorous process themselves, but not surprisingly, most of their criteria align very closely with the same criteria that we've used in Fort Worth and Austin and San Antonio, and most cities have used as well, with certain exceptions. You'll notice that under item number 4, that said additional criteria in order of priority. So they set priority for those criteria, which we have not done in the past. And finally, they said do not consider place of residence of any individual, including any incumbent or political candidate. So Sacramento, again, did not favor the consideration of incumbent-constituent relationships. Okay? And so, very quickly, with respect to procedures, we have been talking about criteria. This is the other side of the coin, the procedures. These are the procedures that we followed in 2012 after the last census. Next slide, please. And the comments that we heard the task force express about those procedures, we heard you say that you'd like for us to continue hosting public workshops and providing software training for instant residents, engaging the public in that way, which we can easily do. And you'd like for us to prepare an analysis of plans submitted by the public and to brief the city council on the merits of different plans that we've received. It is important to note that we are no longer required to secure pre-clearance from the U.S. Department of Justice. So the redistricting process can be done arguably faster now than it could have been done before, because we didn't have to go through that extra step of getting pre-clearance from the Justice Department. Regardless of whether you think that was good or not, good arguments can be made on either side of that question. Nevertheless, that's a step that no longer applies. And finally, one of the comments that we've heard from the task force and from members of the public is that you'd like to see greater transparency in the redistricting process. Historically, we've collected these maps from the public, we've turned them over to the city council, and then we go into radio silence, and we don't hear anything until a map is produced, and then people can respond to it. What we've heard is we want to know what's going on as those maps are being drawn. Now, that may be a bit like watching sausage being made. You may not want to see sausage being made. So you could argue that point on either side, okay? And here's your schedule going forward. In January, after you present your interim report on December 1st, we propose to have this Redistricting 101 seminar probably in the first week of January. This would be, and Michelle Gutt will talk with us in greater detail about it shortly. And then holding a series of public hearings. Now, we'll want to talk with you this afternoon about your preference, because the COVID trends are currently not favorable. And if you can rely on news accounts, they're likely to be worse in January than they are today. And so we may not want to have public meetings out in the community where the virus might spread. We might want to have all of the public meetings done virtually and maybe give residents multiple, maybe 3 different opportunities in different virtual meetings, or they could attend more than one if they want. But that would be an issue for you to consider. Our preference would have been to hold these meetings out in the community, to get more people directly engaged in face-to-face discussions. But in view of the virus trends, we're not sure that would be a good idea. Mr. Espino.
Do one of these in Spanish, citywide, even if it's virtual?
I think that would be a fine idea.
Thank you.
Can we conduct one of these public hearings in Spanish? So if we have 3 or 4 public hearings, one of them can be done in Spanish. Now, you could make the argument that we could have a bilingual, but if you've been involved in bilingual meetings, you know that, and I've heard Mr. Espino conduct and translate meetings And if you really want to hear Sal Espino speak twice as long, then...
I'm being good today. I'm not talking as much. I will say this. English speakers don't really want to hear the Spanish, so that would be my preference would be to do it all in Spanish, because English speakers are patient, but they don't want to hear the information.
It's redundant. It's redundant. And so we may want to have one hearing exclusively in Spanish, and then translate the findings so that the substance of the hearings is available in both languages. So great idea. We had not contemplated that, but I think it makes a lot of sense. So those public hearings would be in January, probably the second and third weeks of the month. And Michelle may want to float some dates by us for your convenience. And we would encourage as many members of the task force to attend these public hearings as you can, as well as the seminar, because the seminar we propose to be live, interactive. Even though it'd be virtual, it would still be live, and you could respond to questions on the spot. And we could also record it, so if somebody misses a seminar, they could still watch it on the city's website. But we want an opportunity for people to ask questions live of the task force chair or of staff. So that would be the public engagement segment of your work. Then you would reconvene the task force in February to review what you heard in the public hearings and decide how you want to incorporate that information into your final recommendations. And then you deliver your final report to the City Council in March. And later in March, the City Council would adopt a resolution accepting your final report and essentially agreeing to follow your criteria and procedures. So that's the schedule that we contemplate for the task force in the new year.
Mr. Costa, the council doesn't have to accept every recommendation.
No, ma'am. No, they do not have any obligation, but why are we here? If we don't expect them, at the very least, to respect everything you recommend, but they are under no obligation to accept in their entirety all of the recommendations that you make. Thank you for that clarification. And then after you deliver your final report and the council accepts it, the redistricting schedule itself would follow the outline that you see on the screen. We'd have the 2021 election, so it's actually the next city council that would conduct the redistricting process. We would get the block level data by the end of July, 1st of August, and then you'd have that joint work session between the task force members and the city council. The council we currently contemplate would have a redistricting process during the months of August through December. That's a compressed time frame. And if we can get some relief at the end with the printing of voter registration cards, then we'd have a little extra time to engage in redistricting. A harder deadline would be establishing residency within council districts for those residents who wish to run for office. And then they would have a period of time in January and February of 2023 in which to qualify for the May 2023 election. Next slide, please. So finally, this has been a long presentation. Appreciate your patience. We've tried to summarize a set of potential redistricting criteria. We don't expect you to agree with all of these criteria. We wanted to put these up on the board so that you could comment on each one and tell us on which criteria you agree, on which you disagree, or wish to change or delete altogether, or if there are any other criteria that you'd like to add to the list that you want to present to the City Council. So these are the same criteria that we described earlier. Number one, approximately equal size. Number two, no packing. Now here's the suggestion that we're making. You may think that this is too tight or too loose. The proportion of combined minority population of each district must be less than 90%. Now some would say, well, that figure should be 80%. Anyway, 90% is just a rule of thumb that would constitute packing. You may say that 80 or 85% is a form of packing. That's fine. You'd be perfectly correct to say so. There is no magic number. It's a subjective decision as to how to set the threshold for what constitutes packing. The example that I gave you earlier showed you something like 90% packing, but that figure could be lower. Number 3, and for whatever reason, the PowerPoint didn't show up with the right font. It must be a function of this machinery. The minimum number of minority opportunity districts, you would set a minimum number with the combined minority population greater than 50%, that's a definition of an opportunity district, in proportion to the city's combined minority population. So if you have in the 2020 census, a population of 900,000, 60% of which is persons of color, 60%, and you have 10 districts, that means that 6 of the 10 districts would have to be minority opportunity districts. And if it happens that you had 40% Hispanic, even though right now the criterion focuses only on combined minority population, but you could actually apply that same line of thought to Hispanic and African American population. So if we had, let's say, 40% Hispanic and 20% African American in the 2020 census, then the goal would be to have at least 4 Hispanic opportunity districts and at least 2 African American opportunity districts. That's again based on total population, not voting age, not registered voters. So there's no guarantee that you'd get that kind of representation on the city council. So that's a big topic, and you can decide. You'll notice we didn't give a number. We said it's a function of the 2020 census data. But if it's 60% minority, that means 6 of the 10 districts would be minority opportunity districts. Number 4, no retrogression of minority participation. Number 5, compact districts. And here we're suggesting if you want to have a numerical measure, a ratio greater than or equal to 0.050. That's very low. And that would mean that a district like District 7, which wraps around Lake Worth from the Cultural District all the way out to Alliance Airport, would not meet that criterion. Now, District 3 would have a very hard time meeting any criterion because the city limits are so irregular in Southwest Fort Worth. Nevertheless, you could set a criterion, a minimum compactness score of 0.050 if you wanted to set a minimum. Now, you could set that figure at whatever you want. We're saying that if you had this threshold, then 6 of the 8 existing districts would meet it. Districts 7 and 3 would not meet this criterion. Now, again, since you're going from 8 to 10 districts, it'll be a little easier to create compact districts. And so that may be a reasonable threshold to establish. Contiguous territory, identifiable geographic boundaries, contain communities of interest. Number 9, we put on here for your discussion purposes only. Yes, continue to include areas inside the loop and outside the loop. And you have to tell us whether you agree with that or not. Number 10, contain whole voting precincts. Number 11, whole blocks or block groups. And finally, I think we're hearing that you don't want to consider place of residence of incumbents or potential candidates, but you need to be the ones telling us that. So this is the list that we would suggest that you use as a basis for your discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Quite comprehensive. Before we move into discussion mode, are there any questions or comments from any of the task force members?
This is Teresa Ayala. I do have a quick question. Please.
Surely.
In one of the earlier bullets of the presentation, there was a reference to the populations as a whole, and it said voters that are, I think it was Hispanic, non-registered voters. I just wanted to find out how old, when were those 2 particular bullets pulled? It was, I think it was referencing Hispanic and African Americans. It was towards the beginning. Just to kind of get a date, a a mindset around how old that data is or how new it is.
Well, the data on the existing council districts,
Yeah, it was at
Was
the
that
very
Mr.
beginning. You were talking about local trends, four bullets, and there were local trends, I
slide
think.
number 5.
Yeah, slide 5.
on this presentation?
Yes, go a little further back. That one, those 2 bullets there. Just for context, when was that?
Well, those are trend data.
Right.
And Hispanics have represented the fastest growing demographic group at least since 2000, but
Okay.
certainly since the 2010 census, and they continue to be the fastest growing demographic group.
So this is based, that's why I'm wondering, this is 2010 data right here?
Actually, it includes current estimates of the population, the most recent of which would have been 2018.
18, okay.
Okay, that just wanted it for context, because I wasn't sure where it was coming from. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. It's a longstanding trend up to the present moment.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Any other entreaties from the task force?
Yeah, I had a question.
Sure.
Just curious, the list of potential redistricting criteria, was that put together by the city staff based on comments that we had made, or just, I'm just curious.
That is our inference. That is our inference of what the task force has been telling us. But some of those criteria are really up for you to discuss this afternoon.
Mr. Brasher, I think what they did was they, sitting in the room, listening to us, and then I would assume that you went back and looked at the
Yes, ma'am,
recording?
and sometimes we inferred from your questions
Yes.
whether you were driving at a certain point. So none of this is definitive. This is up for you to discuss. Do you agree or disagree with what we've captured?
Are you comfortable with that response, Mr. Bradshaw?
I am. It just, it's just, I wanted to make sure that we all knew that, and it's like number 3 is a very interesting one, but it also, you really kind of want to dig into that to make sure you're understanding the full ramifications of what that says in terms of each part of it. It's not just a very simple.
No, it's not.
Criteria. So, anyway.
Mr. Shore? You're on mute, sir.
Yeah, I just think we should separate the criteria, which are really, I think, mandatory in order to meet Constitutional and Voting Rights Act requirements. I think numbers 1 through 4, I think all 4 of those are really, truly, they are required. I don't think they're really optional, although the actual numbers that are used are up for discussion. So what I think would be a good would be to go through items 5 through 12, and if there are any of these items that we want to knock out, I would start by knocking out those that the group doesn't agree with, and then deciding of the remaining ones what priorities they should be. And I think this is a really good set of criteria with maybe a couple of adjustments, but I do think it matches pretty well what the general sense of the group.
Well, Mr. Shore, I'm so glad that anybody else with any question? Mr. Espino?
I think staff has done a good job here. I agree, Mr. Shore, there are certain legal requirements we have to follow. I'll just give you my 2 cents worth, and this will start the discussion and debate, and I respect everyone here on the task force with their opinions. I'm in favor of eliminating number 9, because when you go to 10 single-member districts, there's no way you're going to include districts inside Loop 820 and outside 820. Right now, you have what? District 6, which is outside the loop, and District 9, which is inside the loop, that doesn't touch. So I would eliminate number 9, but and then obviously number 12 is fine. Don't consider place of residence of incumbents. And then the only other thing I would say with number 3, opportunity districts. I think we need to be very careful on that because in Fort Worth, we have a tradition of 2 districts, 5 and 8, that have historically elected African Americans to the city council. And if you look at slide 10 on page 5 of the prior PowerPoint, that district, I will say this, the African American community, you know, they do turn out, even though voter turnout is low in municipal elections, in districts 5 and 8, even though they don't hit 50% or more of the population anymore, they do turn out. And if you're going to be elected to the city council in district 5 and 8, you're going to need African American support. So I don't know how we say that in our criteria, but we need to respect the tradition of having at least 2 African American districts. And when we say opportunity districts, and then maybe legal can illuminate, even with the Hispanic population, we need to look at citizen voting age. Yeah, population is great because the census counts all people. You recall there was a Supreme Court case where the administration was trying to exclude the counting of non-citizens. So if you look at the Hispanic population, yes, it's grown, but it's a very young population. So you have a lot of folks under 18, and yes, there is a part of the Hispanic population that are not citizens. They could be legal permanent residents that are not naturalized, and yes, they could be residents without legal status, right? For example, the Dreamers, the young people that have DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and other folks that are here that are not documented. So I think when we look at this, we need to be, if we were looking at opportunity districts, I want to define that and say, with due respect to the tradition of Fort Worth, given the African American opportunity to elect 2 candidates, or I don't know how you say that, we got to be careful because illegally you cannot redistrict solely by race. Legal pointed that out. But we need to give people in communities of interest the opportunity to select a candidate of their choice. And District 2 is a prime example. District 2 has elected Hispanics and non-Hispanics. Jim Lane was a council member in District 2 from 1993 to 2005. Other council districts have done the same thing. So I think we need to be very careful on that. But I do think that the city of Fort Worth has grown more diverse. And unfortunately, our council has not grown diverse. Now, our council and the city of Fort Worth have done a great job with gender diversity. We have right now, let's see, Betsy Price, Ann Zeta, Kelly, and Gina, 4 women on the city council. Our city, the second largest city in Fort Worth, just elected an African American. They have 3 African Americans on their council and 2 Hispanics. They just elected another Hispanic. So Arlington, under 8-1, has done a much better job with diversity. And over in Dallas, they have 5 Hispanics and they have several African Americans on their council. So I think we just need to be careful how we define. Obviously, the law on minority opportunity is clearly established, but we need to respect the fact that in districts 5 and 8, we may not get to 50% African American.
No, we're not even there now.
But we need to at least stay in the 40s. You know what I mean?
Guys.
This is Linda Kennedy. I'd like to go back to what Mr. Schur said with respect to, we know that 1, 2, 3, and 4 are probably the reason that a lot of us are on this task force, because we want to see good representation of all of our neighbors in our city, on our city council. But these are going to be the 4 points that are going to be the stickiest ones, and the ones where we're going to need probably the most help from our city attorney's office to understand. So I think that if we look at 5 through 12, I think those are the ones where we could probably pop through those more quickly using the information that we got today on city demographics and where people live, and just what we know about what we really care about, and decide whether 5 through 12 are important redistricting criteria. If we can knock out like these low-hanging fruit, then we can focus our energy and our effort and our time and the resources of people like our city attorneys and Mr. Costa to help us really focus in on 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Great. One of the things that I wanted to do today, all of us received Mr. Schur's, Ms. Kayser was kind enough to email it and send it out to folks. And I wanted to give him an opportunity, Mr. Schur, maybe 5 minutes or so, if you could just talk us through to begin our discussion this evening, and then we can proceed. Would you do that?
I may not be able to spend 5 minutes. First of all, with what I drafted, those are off of the top of my head comments. But I think that what Mr. Espino has pointed out is truly the main problem that we have in Fort Worth, which is that the creation of minority opportunity districts will not necessarily result in outcomes that, just because they are minority by population, turn out to yield the results that are desired. I mean, I can see using minority opportunity districts, I can see a council that, were it not for the higher voting percentages of African American citizens, might very well end up with retrogression in the election of black representatives. It could also result in not having as many Hispanics to achieve it. So I think that is the biggest problem that we're going to have to face. And I think it is best that we defer that issue to the very end. I personally believe that in today's environment, we should not consider the place of residence of incumbents or potential candidates. I recognize that our current council members, the incumbents, have devoted a great deal of their time, effort, and have developed tremendous expertise, and that the loss of incumbents can result in a loss of talent at the council level. But on the other hand, because the council has reserved to itself the ability to establish the voting districts rather than going to an independent commission, I am concerned that if they are allowed to consider their own place of residency and making criteria, that it is going to create an image of buddymandering. And at the end of this process, no matter what we select, there are going to be angry people. I think that is going to be inevitable. And I would prefer that we simply not put the council members in the position of being accused of putting their own interest in service above the other interests that are important to the city. So I would eliminate number 12. I agree entirely with Mr. Espino on number 9, that the inclusion of areas inside and outside Loop 820, in every single council district is not feasible. Further, I would think that a pie-shaped district would effectively, with 10 districts, if we slice this thing up like a pie, I think it would possibly disenfranchise everybody living really in some of the inner city districts. So I would eliminate number 9. I don't know what would be a really good formula for saying that we will have some districts that are predominantly inside Loop 820 and some that are really predominantly outside or entirely outside Loop 820. But I do think that as worded, number 9 needs to come out. I think that the compactness of districts, it's a nice concept, and it does reduce the likelihood that someone is going to claim that the districts were gerrymandered on the basis of race or to favor specific incumbents. But I think that is a very, very low priority, and particularly after hearing what Mr. Costa said about the districts that we have right now, I don't think number 5 is feasible. So those are the 3 main areas. I think the communities of interest are important. Identifiable geographic boundaries, positions of rivers and things like that. Yeah, they're nice. It makes it easy for people to understand who's representing whom, but I am not sure that some of these boundaries the geographic boundaries are as important as others. So I think contiguous territory and, compact districts and identifiable geographic boundaries need to drop much lower on the list. So that's pretty much, I think, a summary of what I had to say.
Great, thank you, Mr. Shore. So there's a discussion, well, a proposal on the table that we kind of include 1 through 4, and then try to discuss 5 through 12. And I guess, is that a consensus that, Mr. DeVito, I see the frown on your face.
I do have a couple of comments on this. First, I agree that we need to assign priority. If we have not voiced that to this point, I think that we absolutely need to assign priority to these criteria. I agree that number 5, the ratio is unlikely to be met based on the size of the city and the required sizes of the new districts. So compact, yes, but the application of the ratio is unlikely. I too would delete number 9. I would just delete that altogether. I would like to comment that on number 12, you're going to have a lot easier time getting the council to agree to this if you preserve that, but as the lowest priority. If you preserve consideration of the residents and the constituent relationship as the lowest priority, right here where it's listed at number 12. And then I have some real concerns about number 3. As I look at Mr. McAvoy's map indicating minority areas in the city, to achieve number 3, I think you're really going to have to gerrymander some districts based on these concentrations that I'm looking at in slide number 9 on Mr. McAvoy's presentation. To accomplish what Mr. Espino was talking about, a 60% minority opportunity district, because it does, the residents do seem to be concentrated in the central and southeastern, south and southeastern part of the city, which I believe is going to require some really cut up districts to accomplish 6 of the 10 districts with the desired composition. So I don't really have a suggestion on that. I'm just throwing that out there. I think that's going to be impossible to hit unless somebody smarter than me has some ideas on that.
I think you can wordsmith that to say that council should consider an equitable number of opportunity districts without really putting that criteria, because as I mentioned, you're not going to get to a council district, 2 council districts that have more than 50% African-American population now. So I think we just need to maybe wordsmith that number 3 and say council should consider, creating the maximum possible, I don't even like the word minority, opportunity districts as required by the Voting Rights Act, something like that. We can get legal to come up with some language that we can all are comfortable with. I don't like that 50% requirement because, as I've indicated, districts 5 and 8 didn't hit 50%, and they've always elected an African-American, and that's just the choice of that community. It can change because other districts have elected. District 9, which has a majority Hispanic population, has never elected a Hispanic candidate. So I think we just need to keep that open-ended, and I agree with you on that.
I agree that there's definitely a place for number 3 in the pecking order here, but I believe it needs to be reworked or reworded in such a way that it just fits better.
Okay, our city attorney is.
Linda Kennedy again. I just wanted to say I didn't say that we need to keep in 1 through 4. My suggestion was let's discuss 5 through 12 because they're the easiest to discuss.
Okay.
And then go back and discuss 1 through 4 because they're the most difficult to discuss.
Great.
Chair, this is Teresa Ayala, Chair. May I have the comment, please?
Sure, Ms. Ayala.
Yes, thank you. Just further to the discussion around number 3, I too am thinking that, I don't know about whether we need to describe it as a minority opportunity district. I do like the suggestion around the opportunity districts, or maybe we look at just defining that a little bit better of what it is we'd like, whether we put a definition around that or something to that effect around, if we're going to leave the minority opportunity districts, I think we do need to look at, based on, you know, the demographic information we've been looking at, the question posed about whether or not these were actually voting age, those types of things. I think there needs to be further clarification around number 3. I would like to make sure that number 1 is should it be 10%? Does it need to be a different number? That's one of the things I had a question around. And then also for number 9, I don't think that I'd like to exclude that one as well. That's just my initial comments.
Okay. I'd like for us to hear from our city attorney's office, and then any other comments, and we'll just plow through this.
Yes, Leanne Guzman with the city attorney's office. And I just wanted to, actually, I was walking up here, but Mr. Espino said basically what I was going to say, which is, you know, I would recommend leaving that in, but massaging the language, because minority opportunity district is a term of art. So I do think you need to stick with that, because that's what all the court cases call it. But there's a test for how one is created. So what's listed here with number 3, I don't know that you could get to that by using those court cases. So I do think I'd be happy to work with you all to come up with some language that still preserves the necessity to create those where necessary, but also make sure that it's compliant with court cases and the law.
Great. So if we can get a consensus, can we just plow through 5 through 12 kind of quickly, and then, since that's maybe low-hanging fruit that we can get done. So let's start with 5 compact districts with a ratio of a 0.050. Any comments?
Do you just want to show of hands? Do you want to do a motion? How do you want to do this?
Well, I was thinking, do we want to have a formal vote with a show of hands, or?
Do a show of hands to show consensus, and someone makes a formal motion in a second, and we all vote on it after we just do an informal consensus check. How about that?
Can we agree on that? Mr. Shore, Ms. Ayala, Mr. Bradshaw?
With our folks that are virtual, in order to do that, let me take this slide down off the screen so we can see better of the folks that are virtual. So hang on, let me do that.
Hang on just a second. Hang on just a second.
For folks that are virtual, and so if you're going to do a show of hands, so.
Now, here's what I think we're proposing. By a show of hands, we'll vote kind of yay or nay on a particular proposal, and then we'll have a motion. Someone will offer a motion that will be properly seconded to move forward. Is that?
The only thing on number 5, I do share Mr. Scher's concern about using that ratio. I think we just need to leave it open and say compact districts, because to ensure compliance with the Voting Rights Act, you may have to do some twisting where some districts may not be compact as others. So I think, because looking at the population trends in the city, I think we have to be careful with how compact they are. I think the ratio might be tough to get. That's just my personal observation. So I would just amend that to say compact districts, period, without putting that ratio.
I would agree.
That's the point I was making. I don't think it's possible to hit that ratio.
Okay.
Well, we don't have to say that we want them to hit the ratio, but we could say that ideally a compact district would have this ratio so that they know that this is what we're working towards, so that they have some idea of what we're defining as a compact district. We're defining a compact district as a district that is somewhere in this ratio, so they're working towards it.
So to use the term ideally?
Madam Chairman.
Yes.
Madam Chairperson.
Yes.
I'd like to get you to just go and explain what we're really saying here on this number 5. What are we really saying when we go through that? I can't see the verbiage now, but we're talking about a ratio there. So would you explain what we're really saying there in that number 5?
Number 5 is compact districts. And we're trying to determine and we're trying to determine what that ratio would be. And ideally, I think, to use Ms. Kennedy's word, the .050 is what would like to get to. But we're not quite sure that we can in many instances. So from the attorney's perspective, what do you?
Well, compactness to me means the geometric shape.
Yeah.
People live near each other. It's not like like you've seen the infamous gerrymandered district in North Carolina, where I would say the most gerrymandered district in the city is Council District 7. If you could put up Council District 7, that's not compact, that's gerrymandered. But that's what I would say. Compactness is like the geometry shape. People live generally near each other, and you look at the geometric shape to make sure it's pretty good looking. It doesn't look like some weird zigzag.
Well, I understand that. That's the reason I want to find out about it, because, see, I'm living in a district now that's been gerrymandered back in 2010, I believe it was. And we're right in here, just a few of us are here, and they took us out of one district and put us in another one. And it must be about 3% of that whole district, people of color. And we have not had any representation from them whatsoever. That's what I was trying to figure out exactly. What did we really mean when we were talking about that compactness in that statement number 5?
Our attorney's here.
Yes, I mean,
If you would speak right into the mic so they can hear you.
I know, I've got my mask on, so
Okay.
that doesn't help. Yeah, I mean, I think that the answers that have been given are good, and they're right. The goal is to use some sort of preferably mathematical formula to try to ensure that gerrymandering isn't happening. I will say, in terms of developing criteria here, the looser that you can make your criteria, the better, because as you can imagine, there's a reason why you rank these criteria, because frankly, some of them create tension with other ones of them. And so as you begin to create these maps, it will, not you personally, but the map makers create these maps, there will be times when you will have to deviate from what a preference may be. So if you have a particular ratio here, it's exactly correct that the map makers may not be able to meet that. Anytime you're not able to meet a criteria that's adopted, it does obviously open you up to legal challenges. So I would just encourage you, one of the suggestions to put perhaps a number in there that's a goal, I think is probably the maximum of what we should do, rather than put a specific number.
Suggestion, and that's been alluded to by Ms. Kennedy, say, we all support compact districts with the goal of this ratio, but not make it a requirement.
Okay. Is that a consensus, Ms. Scott?
Okay.
Raise your hands if that's great, Mr. Williams, Mr. Bradshaw, Mr. Shore, Ms. Kennedy, Ms. Ayala, got you?
Yes.
Okay, all right. All right. Can we move on to, we need a motion.
I move that we adopt the requirement for a compact district with the goal of the Posby-Popper ratio of greater than .050 as a goal, not a requirement.
Is there a second?
I'll second that. This is Teresa Ayala.
Thank you much. All in favor? There we go. Thank you, committee. All right, let's move on to number 6, contiguous territory. Mr. Speedo.
In favor.
He's in favor. Is there any discussion? Any discussion? Ms. Ayala?
I just have a quick question. I just wanted to get clarification on what would be the disadvantages of not having that, just for clarification purposes. I'm not saying that I don't support it. I'm just trying to get clarification.
Contiguous means that the district, you can go from one end of the district to the other. Like you can't have and it's contiguous adjacent to other districts. You can't go like, let's say you had District 2 north side, then you have a gap in between, and then you start over another part.
Yeah.
So
Got it.
So you can go across the district from one end to the other, and it's adjacent to another.
Yeah, a continuous process. Yes.
Clarification.
Okay. Mr. Shore?
I had one comment on that, in answer, Teresa, to your question. If you had 3 minority areas, let's say they were all circles, and they were not contiguous, if you have contiguity, you might not be able to put them together to form a district. In other words, if you're trying to create an opportunity district, contiguity may result in a limitation on that. But even so, I don't think we can do without having contiguity as one of our criteria.
Ms. Scott?
So we're just presenting this as we're just presenting this preliminary. We'll get to use the maps and, you know, kind of figure it out and then come up with a final answer. Is that correct? So we're just coming up with kind of what we'd like to see, and then once we get to draw the maps and get to really look at it, then we'll might have to tweak it or something. Is that true? Yeah, just the criteria. That we can still change. I mean, this is not a final answer that we're doing right now, is it?
According to our timeline, this is, we're creating a list of preliminary or recommendations, but not until March do we
This is
present.
a draft.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a draft.
Because we still haven't heard public comment.
And we're making preliminary findings to the council
Yes.
in December.
But if we find something, you know, we can change
We can
this.
throw it out later.
So, yeah, okay.
We're a task force. That means change. Madam City Attorney?
Y'all got the right conclusion. I was just coming up here to say that in terms of playing with the maps, of course, by the time you present your final, you won't have all of the data that's necessary because y'all are criteria setters. So, but yes, absolutely, you will have another chance to change those.
Okay, so now we're down to number 6, contiguous.
Chair, did you want to take a vote on, or were you about to do the vote on number 6?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kayser, for keeping us on point. Okay. All in favor of number 6?
6, yes.
Raise your hand. Ms. Ayala, Ms. Kennedy. Okay. Mr. Shore, Mr. Bradshaw, Mr. Williams. Okay. Could we have a motion then to accept number 6? I'm sorry? Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. DeVito? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Okay. Mr. Shore, did you vote? Gotcha. Thank you. We're moving on to number 7, identifiable geographic boundaries. Now, I like Mr. Shore's recommendation that street names be added because that's a good sense of boundaries on some of these maps. Any discussion? Any discussion? Ms. Kennedy?
I don't think it's a priority that there be identifiable geographic boundaries. I think when we heard from Austin, they talked about how at one time, you know, like they had some very identifiable, like it had to be one of the major highways. Were some of their original ones that they had to have. And so they had to have it. I think their previous boundaries had to be like a highway or a river or something else. And I don't think that's that important to us. I think just as long as we hit the things that are important as far as populations of people, and the legal things are more important than geographical boundaries. But if we had it in there, I think it would definitely.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment. I'd just like to make a comment about that. You know, it may not be necessary as far as some kind of big sign, but I know when I was on the council, I had streets that was the identifiable district in my representation, and I went up to a certain street, and then on the other side of the street, it was in somebody else's district. So I guess that to me, where I took this to mean something like that, and, you know, but I think that you need something, and even if it's a street or whatever, but most in Fort Worth, you have streets and things like that that divide the districts up.
I agree with,
This is Teresa Ayala. I'm looking at the San Antonio redistricting, and they use the term readily identifiable versus geographically. I don't know if that would give us a little bit of bandwidth or.
What was the language? I didn't hear, I'm sorry.
Readily
It says
identifiable.
Readily identifiable?
Readily identifiable.
Yeah.
Okay,
Can you
then
explain the difference?
Ms. Scott and then Mr. Shore.
can you explain the difference between readily and geographical?
That was going to be my question, if there was some sort of legal definition around that.
Is there a legal no legal definition from?
Okay, then my next comment is, it works a lot easier when you have a line that you can identify. If it's a railroad track or a major street or a highway, I mean, it's easier for the citizens to recognize where their district is. It's easier when a candidate is running to identify where their district stops and starts, to have some major point of, reference.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I'd like to.
Mr. DeVito.
I'd like to suggest that we leave this criterion in. Up in my neighborhood, we have a subdivision that's half in District 4, half in District 7, where if there's some geographic consideration given, hopefully you don't have that happening again. I don't know that I'd go into any more specifics than this, but some general specification of geographic restriction or geographic boundary, I believe, should be left in.
Okay. Mr. Shore?
I just...
You're on mute, Mr. Shore.
Oh, Mr. Shore's on mute.
Yeah, I think it's fine to have geographical boundaries in as a goal, but I think it's like some of these others, they're fine to have, but they really go lower on the list of priorities. And so I'm in favor of having identifiable geographic boundaries as a goal, but as a consideration of what the council may include in their discussions, but it doesn't mean that it's an important one. So I'm in favor of it.
Great. Any other discussion?
I don't think it's necessary, but I guess leaving it in as a lower priority. I mean, geography are physical features of the earth, and I just, quite frankly, in Fort Worth, I mean, I love our city, but there's just not a lot of physical features. It's flat land.
Yeah. Mr. Sure had a good point. Make it a goal, not a requirement.
Yeah.
And just make sure, I think we need to make sure we leave it in there because of the way it is right now. Most of your districts now are separated by a street or something like that. So you need that in there.
Streets aren't geography.
Yeah.
Don't
Okay.
have a problem
So
leaving it in.
We're under, there's a consensus that we would accept identifiable geographic boundaries as a goal, and would probably be in a lower priority.
Most important is communities of interest. If we're looking at down there, because you do want to have that goes to the neighborhoods that you're talking about. You don't want to split neighborhoods, right? And you want to split communities. So when we get to number 8, I think that goes in line with number 7. But so I'm comfortable with 7 the way it is. And if you want to add the language goal, I'm comfortable either way, as long as we make sure that we also move forward with communities of interest, because that is a critical term of art.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So all in favor of number 7 as a goal? Raise your hand. Oh, great. Could we have a motion to accept it? I mean to, Ms. Scott, is there a second?
I second.
Mr. Vito, all in favor? Raise your hand. Okay. Mr. Sure, Mr. Bradshaw, okay. Ms. Ayala, Ms. Kennedy? Great, thank you.
Do we have anyone in opposition to that one? Okay.
I would oppose.
Okay.
I don't think it's necessary.
All right, number 8, moving along here, contain communities of interest in single districts. Discussion?
Yeah, that one's important because, the question is, how do you define communities of interest? Typically, you look at folks that are, bounded by commonalities, whether it's socioeconomic status, they vote a certain way. I don't know. I mean, I guess staff here legal, I need Ms. Leanne Guzman to tell us how what other cities or other communities have defined communities of interest. But that's a term of art, and you don't want to split communities like neighborhoods. Like, let's say up in the far North Fort Worth, Heritage, right? It's split between District 7 and 4, and there's other communities throughout the city that may be split along that, but we need to define what, or what communities of interest are really. But I do like this one.
Any other discussion? Ms. Ayala? Were you raising your hand?
Yes, I was just kind of looking for consistency, but that seems to be consistent across the board with the presentations that we saw, and then also for the other city as well. So I do like it. I do think it's important. And I think it was Mr. Vito also brought up about the fact that his particular community is split. So I think it's important to keep it.
Okay, Ms. Kennedy?
Yeah, I think this one's important, and I think when we do go to the council, though, that I think I would like that we have, maybe not as our recommendations as these are communities of interest, like a big long list for them that's in our redistricting criteria, like these are all the communities of interest, but I would like for us to maybe help create a very diverse list of communities of interest to present to council. And maybe that can be part of our community outreach program, is, asking the community to bring us, their ideas. What do you think are the communities of interest that we need to bring to the council and say, these are communities of interest that are important to the citizens of Fort Worth that need to be included, or at least need to be considered.
Great. Mr. Costa? Coming to you, Mr. Scherer.
Yes, I totally agree with the last comment. And I also believe that moving communities of interest really needs to go up higher on the priority list. Truly, the communities of interest also, to some extent, assist in achieving the first 4 goals in terms of, there just are neighborhoods that do that have historically reflected certain populations, and I think that's important. And I also think that the neighborhoods that have taken the opportunity to formally organize themselves into neighborhood associations, those are communities of interest that should be recognized. And I think the idea of going to citizens and saying, we think, the communities of interest are important. What are your communities of interest that you think we should take into consideration, or the council should take into consideration? That is about as important a thing you can do in citizen participation, is to say, where do you think you belong, as I can imagine. So.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Costa?
Just wanted to convey a word of caution in respect to the term communities of interest. It is obviously, I think everyone in this room or around this table would agree this is an important criterion. And we can provide you with a map, for example, of neighborhoods or registered neighborhood associations. That is one way to define communities of interest. But communities of interest means a lot more than that, conceivably. Now, if you want to have a very narrow definition, we can give you a definition that correlates with neighborhood associations, and that would be fine. That would be defensible. However, a community of interest could be something like LGBT population, which is not mapped. We don't ask people, what is your sexual orientation? We don't ask people to disclose that. We don't have maps. That kind of data would not be readily available. A community of interest might be people of a certain religion. Of a certain religion, Jewish population, for example, or Muslim. We don't map that information. We don't ask people what their religious faith or absence of faith might be. But it's still a community of interest. People who call themselves environmentalists represent a community of interest. And sometimes they live in proximity to each other, but we don't map that kind of information. And so my point is, communities of interest means more than just registered neighborhood associations that we can map. Now, we can give you that kind of data, but you want to discuss whether you want to confine yourself to neighborhoods or whether you want to take a broader view of what constitutes a community of interest.
Well, obviously, it's the broader view because you want to comply with the law. You know, that's what I would say. And then there's all kinds of factors. Maybe as we go forward, we can, as Ms. Kennedy said, when we go out to the public, we can look at all these factors that are considered. It's not just neighborhoods, like you said, it's a bunch of other stuff. But definitely communities of interest, as Mr. Scher said, is one of the most important factors in redistricting.
Okay, Ms. Ayala and then Mr. DeVito.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to ask is whether or not there was any sort of standard or definition that we could use as a baseline, and then as we reach out as for this community of interest, and if there is, then we could reach out to the community as a whole in the city and give them some criteria. I just didn't know if there was something that existed like that.
Page, slide number 13 in our presentation defines
Yes.
communities of interest.
And so that's why I was thinking, if we just stayed within that, and I think we should be fine, but I think this is really important to keep in there.
Yeah, slide 13 has an excellent broad definition that can be further on, more
On page
detailed.
Slide 13 where?
On page 7.
Madam Chair, I think for our purposes here today,
Thank you.
leaving it as written, communities of interest in single districts, I think that's probably appropriate for our purposes here today. I do agree that it should be given a higher priority. It probably should be bumped up ahead of boundaries, geographic boundaries.
Okay.
And then as the workshops progress throughout the communities, the different subgroups that Mr. Costa referenced or whatever develops as a subgroup could be fleshed out and then given some consideration in the final mapping process.
Because what we don't want to do is shut people out or ignore people.
Right.
That's for absolute sure.
Or
Okay.
split Como.
Great. So on number 8, are we in favor of communities of interest in single districts? Item 8. All right. If we are supportive of that, would you raise your hand? Mr. Bradshaw, Mr. Shore, great. All right. Could we have a motion to adopt that one? Number 8, to contain communities of interest.
I so move.
I'll second that. This is Teresa Ayala.
Thank you, Ms. Ayala. All in favor, would you raise your hand? Groovy smoothie, moving right along. Include areas inside Loop 820 and areas outside Loop 820, if possible, within each council district. We're open for discussion.
Well, I had already said no to that one. I'm happy to hear from other task force members.
I'll second Sal's motion.
I say no.
That's my motion. I already have a second, but we're open to any discussion.
But we do want other task force members to have to express an opinion. Mr. Williams?
Well, I guess my only question, comment would be, right now, when you talk about the city of Fort Worth, and you talk about the number of people we have here, what's going to happen, you're going to have these 10 districts, and it's going to be really, really hard to really draw 10 districts without probably somewhere including part of inside of 820 and outside of 820. I guess that to me is the only thing that I would be concerned about, because I think right now, what districts do we have now that do not include inside and outside of 820?
6.
You have 6?
6 districts. I know it doesn't, that's where I live.
Wait a minute.
Is that the only one?
6 and
9.
Mr. Costa says 6 and 9.
6 and 9.
Yes.
But I guess the thing that I would be concerned about would be trying to make sure we do this, because we've got to understand we're trying to put at least 90,000 people in each one of these districts. And it means that we're going to have to really do some very good carving of the city to get those 10 districts in and not include some in and outside of 820, when you really think about 820. I guess that's the only thing that I was saying about it. I wouldn't say right now that I vote, say, don't include, because I don't know. And that's something that I don't know, if we can do that and do what we're trying to do, put 90,000 people in each one of those districts. I guess that's the only thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't want
Mrs.
to.
Kennedy and then Mr. Shore.
Yeah, I can't see, looking at the map, how you would be able to divide it up in a wagon wheel and with 10 spokes and not break up voting precincts and census blocks and block groups. There would just be no way to do that. And also, like I said, I live in a district that doesn't have part of the inner loop in it as well, and I think it's probably fine to not include an area inside of 820 for us. I understand the reasoning why they wanted there to be part of the central city and part of the outside for everybody, but I just can't see how it would work just looking at the maps if we want to keep some of these other things together.
Great. Mr. Shore?
I don't think it should be a criteria, nor do I think it should be a goal. But if as a practical matter, it turns out that we can't put together districts of 90,000 without actually doing exactly that, then that's fine. It's just not, it's not a criteria we superimpose on other more important criteria.
And we've already established that there's going to be a deviation in some of these districts anyway. Ms. Scott?
Can I just ask, what is the benefit of having, why is this an issue? What would be the benefit of every district having a piece inside the loop? What?
Yeah.
I don't understand why this is a question. Why?
I'd like to discuss
Mr.
that a
Shore.
little bit. Yeah. One of the problems as cities grow is that I think many cities have in the inner city, they have infrastructure which was not truly adequately planned for the kinds of growth that were there. And the areas that are being developed now, I'm sure that the infrastructure planning that we now have is far superior in terms of meeting needs for things like stormwater, sewer, you name it, building streets that are properly done. And so there is a certain degree of tension between some of the newer developed areas that really, frankly, don't want to spend tax money improving the central city upon which they and the entire city depends. So I think that maybe the idea of having people in the central city, or at least within 820, be included in every district was to create the idea that each council member would have constituents within that area who would not be completely, overwhelmed by the suburban dwellers. Now, maybe that's not correct, but I think that was probably the intention. But I think that doing the pie shape with a hub and spoke arrangement would disenfranchise probably pretty much the central city people altogether. So I think it would be a perverse consequence. So I think it's better to leave this as a loose, leave it out as a criterion, and that it should not be something that we try to do. If it happens, it happens.
Yeah, and the other consideration council had on having both inside and outside the loop was one of the critiques about going to too many single-member districts is people become more parochial. Council members may only say my council district, and not look at the city as a whole. And so one of the considerations with connecting both inside the loop and outside the loop was a council member would have areas of both new growth areas and older areas and have a more global view. But my experience on the council forward is that council members, even with districts totally inside the loop or even outside the loop, always they looked at their council districts, but the experience in Fort Worth is that everybody worked together as a team for the benefit of the city as a whole, both from individual single-member districts to the entire city. So I don't think we need that either. I think we just need to strike that out because under 10-1, it's going to be very difficult to do that anyway.
Okay.
Okay,
Any
I would
other
just like
discussion?
yeah, I'd like to just comment on that. I go along with what Espino was saying right there, and I hate to have to refer back, when I was on the council, I had District 5. And the point was that there were some districts that were inside that were not divided all out. But as a city group, and what we're trying to do now to go with 10 districts, it's probably going to be pretty hard to not have some of your district inside of 820, some outside. And I'm not saying that we need to have that as a mandatory deal or even put it in there, but just let the chips fall where they fall when you start drawing the map itself in the districts. But I'm just saying that it's kind of hard to say you can't have. I would definitely not want to say you can't have both inside and outside of 820.
Yeah,
But just leave it and say whatever, however the chips fall, that's fall. If part of the district's going to be inside of 820, fine. Outside it, fine. I have no problem with that.
I think we're not saying that it can't be, we're just saying that it doesn't need to be a goal, that it is both, right? It may well be, but it doesn't need to be a goal.
Take it out of the criteria.
Take it out.
Yeah, well,
Motion.
is
and
that the,
second.
now, let's go, are we done with our discussion? Can we just have a show of hands of who would recommend that we take 9 out completely? Ms. Kennedy? Okay. I don't see anybody that, thank you, Mr. Williams. Thank you, Mr. Bradshaw. Thank you, Ms. Ayala. So we're on general consensus that 9 would be ejected. Correcto, Mundo? All right. I just want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding. 9 will be rejected. Can I have a motion to that effect?
I so move.
We have one.
Okay.
Mr. Espino and Mr. Allen. I believe.
Mr. Allen, great. All in favor of the rejection of 9? I love you guys. Okay, thank you. Now, number 10, contain whole voting precincts. This one should be quick and simple. All in favor of containing whole voting precincts? Raise your hand. All right, can I have a motion to accept that one?
Motion to accept retaining all voting precincts.
Precincts, yes. As a second?
I will, Teresa. I'll
Thank you,
second.
Ms. Ayala. Great. Number 11. Well, yes, that's right. We do have to vote. All in favor of number 10 to contain whole voting precincts, raise your hand. Mr. Schur, Mr. Bradshaw, Ms. Ayala, Ms. Kennedy. Great, thank you. Number 11, contain whole census blocks or block groups.
Can we define that again? What is that? Is there a cheat?
Contain whole census blocks or block groups.
What does that mean?
So in the census tracts, I'm not an expert, but Mr. Spino, if you want to.
Well, when the census gives you the information, they give you information by census tracts, blocks, block groups. And what this says is you don't split them up. And sometimes for redistricting, you split them up, sort of like on some of these boundaries or neighborhoods. And so what this says, just keep them together, right? So that's when the census counts, they do it in these blocks or block groups. You want to keep them together. That's kind of like the census numerology, the way they count and the way they do it. I don't know if staff, maybe one of our planners can explain it better than I can, but that's my layman's understanding of how the census counts. Mr. Flatiger, if you want to get up there and tell us the exact.
And this goes to contiguous territories also, doesn't it?
Eric Flatiger, Planning and Development. Yes, that's exactly right. The geographies that the Census Department uses to do counts, to do estimates, to collect information on the population is expressly within these specific boundaries. And the boundaries sort of, they're kind of like a Chinese doll. They sort of mesh. But if you split those boundaries up, what you're losing is the ability to accurately understand what the population numbers are, the demographics associated with the population within those boundaries. So you essentially you fuzz up the numbers across those council districts.
Any other discussion on it, Mr. DeVito?
So I think it's important to leave it in, but I believe it's placed in the correct priority where it's listed now. Other considerations may come in higher, and in which case it would bump this out. But I believe it should be left in, and it's in the correct spot here for priority.
I'll just read the census definition. A census block is an area bounded by visible features such as streets or railroad tracks, or by invisible boundaries such as city limits. A block group is a cluster of blocks within a tract.
Okay. And this will really come into play, I think, when we get to figuring out our communities of interest. I mean, I look at I grew up in Como. You wouldn't want the census blocks or the block groups that are in Como to be, taken out and put in somebody else's census tract. I mean, I would imagine Como would be up in arms about that. Okay. All in favor? Any other discussion on containing whole census blocks or block groups? Mr. Shore?
I have a question as to how important it is to keep block groups together as opposed to blocks. I understand from Mr. Flanagan that if you don't use some of the census data, you lose the ability to provide the precise demographic information you want for these other objectives. But do you need the block groups as well as the blocks?
No. From the head shake from Mr. Costa, no, we don't.
It's an or, so you can consider
He's important. Mr. Costa is coming to the microphone.
So as Mr. Espino suggested in his definition from the Census Bureau, the census geography is scaled in tiers. So the smallest geographic unit is the block. And I think Mr. Schur might argue that it makes sense to preserve the integrity of the census block. That's the smallest unit. You don't want to split a block. A block group is a cluster of blocks, and they may loosely represent neighborhoods, but not necessarily. And so you may say that the communities of interest criterion of the two is the more important. And so you might want to preserve blocks, but not necessarily block groups, if you're also going to be preserving communities of interest. And then the next higher tier of census geography would be the census tract. That would be a group of block groups. And so I think you could make an argument that preserving the integrity of blocks is important, certainly more important than block groups. But you could go either way.
Okay. Any other comments?
The language or, so it's either or. So I'm comfortable with the way 11 read.
Yeah, they say that a block group is about 600 to 3,000 people. So we're not talking about, huge, number of people given, we're talking about 90,000 people in, an entire district.
Okay. I think the important rejoinder there is blocks or block groups. So we have some option there. All right. All in favor of number 11 to contain whole census blocks or block groups? Would you raise your hand? Great. Could we have a motion to accept that as a criteria? Mr. DeVito?
So moved.
Oh, who? Ms. Ayala?
So moved. This is Teresa, yes.
Okay. Ms. Ayala, is there a second?
Second.
Ms. Scott? All in favor? Raise your hand. Great, thank you. Now, our last one is number 12. Do not consider place of residence of incumbents or potential candidates. The floor is open for discussion.
Well, everybody knows my opinion on that. I'm in favor of eliminating that as a consideration.
I agree.
Mr. Shore and then Ms. Kennedy.
Just to
I think
clarify.
that's along with what is being stated. I think that the residents of a incumbent should be considered in what we're doing today.
Okay. Mr. Shore.
To clarify, this criteria is basically, as I read it, is a commandment to the council members that as they draw these districts, they are not to consider places of residence, their own places of residence, or those of potential candidates. So this, if you take this criteria out, it doesn't, you know, you would be, it's a little weaker in the sense, I mean, really, we're trying to say that we do not want you to consider this. You may not consider it.
No, I agree with you. I'm sorry. I misspoke. I'm in favor of the language to not consider it. So you're right, Mr. Sher. Great clarification.
Mr. DeVito, you have an opinion one way or the other?
I like the verbiage from the 2012 guidelines, and I also like it as the lowest of priorities, but I did like the preserve incumbent constituent relations where possible.
Okay.
That was my only comment.
Any other discussion?
I still
Ms.
don't
Kennedy?
know how we would preserve incumbent relationships, even where possible, if we're going from 8 to 10 council districts. I think that just muddies the water for them and makes it harder for them to make 10 equally
Populated,
equal-sized
yeah.
districts.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think the majority of what we're going to create with new districts is going to come out of District 7. As we pointed out, 7 is gigantic.
Yeah.
And that's where all the population growth has been, much of the population growth in the north and west. So it's probably going to result in that district being sliced up pretty much, two to three times. And other districts will probably remain relatively unchanged. And I think some consideration should be given to the current council members within their districts. I think maybe Mr. Costa mentioned using the current map as a baseline from which to begin when the mappers do sit down and draw this. I don't think that's particularly a bad thing, and then apply all of these different criteria from there. But bottom line is, my opinion is that I think that it should be left in as the lowest of priorities. It may come to pass, it may not come to pass, but to take it out altogether doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Okay. Ms. Scott?
I was just going to say that some of the council members live in communities of interest, so it would stay, they would stay within that community, and maybe, I guess the district, I don't think it moves that much, because like you said, it'd be 7 that we'd have the most growth and the most change. So, yes, I agree with the language.
Ms. Ayala and then Mr. Shore.
I'm fine. I'm listening to all the comments, and I'm fine with the link. I'm fine with it as well.
Okay. Mr.
Thank
Shore?
you for the clarification.
Sure. Mr. Shore?
Mute.
You on mute, Mr. Shore?
I think it's unlikely, no matter what we say, that the council members are going to deliberately place themselves in where they have to face each other in an election. I just don't think that's going to happen. But I don't think that we have to, I think it creates an appearance of what's called buddy-mandering to say that this is a permissible criteria. So removing this as a criteria is actually, I think, one step towards negating the argument that, hey, look, those council members are trying to protect their own positions, and I would just rather not put that target on their backs. we have enough problems in this community that we are here for the specific purpose of addressing. And that is in large part the race relation problems that we have and the underrepresentation of communities, and to have preservation of council member relationships as a goal in the face of the problem that we're unbalanced right now, I think is thoroughly unwise. So I would leave in number 12 as worded.
Agree.
Ms. Kennedy, did you have a comment? Okay. Any other comments?
Mr. Bradshaw has a comment.
Mr. Bradshaw, okay. Go ahead, Mr. Bradshaw.
I really think that what Mr. Schur said is important, and I just want to actually go one step further. I mean, the fact that we, I think all would prefer to have more independence and less in this process, and to consider an incumbent, i.e. one person in the entire city and his or her relations with their district higher than the equity of the people in that district, kind of flies in the face of what this is all about.
Great. All right. By show of hands, number 12, do not consider place of residence of incumbents or potential candidates. All in favor of that language, please raise your hand.
Chairman, would you read that statement again for me, please?
Number 12 says, do not consider place of residence of incumbents or potential candidates. So in essence, in the criteria, we're saying council don't consider the place of residence of an incumbent or a potential candidate in deciding the redistricting as a criteria. Again, let's show our hands if you're for number 12. Do not consider the place of residence of incumbents or potential candidates. Okay? Those of you that are for that, please raise your hands. You want the incumbent to be the place of residence and potential candidates to be considered. Mr. Williams, I see a frown on your face.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. No, what I'm saying is that we should not consider the resident of a candidate or a council person when we're drawing the map. Just simple as that.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
So is any other discussion? We're done with that and we've made a preliminary kind of, can we have a motion?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Is there a second?
Seconded.
By Ms. Scott, Ms. Ayala, great. All in favor of number 12, please raise your hand. Thank you much. Okay.
And we have one opposition, is that correct?
Yes, one opposition, Mr. DeVito. Now, can we go back to I appreciate everyone's participation in 5 through 12. Can we go back to the top and just kind of, we need to, as we discuss this, kind of prioritize? So we have a sense of, Mr. Costa, isn't that the direction we want to go now? Let's go through 1 through 4 are a little tricky. So let's start with 1. Approximately equal size, meaning as a criteria, approximately equal size population of the largest district is plus or minus 10% more than the population of the smallest district. Is there any discussion?
That seems fair to me.
Any discussion? Any more discussion?
I also think
Mr. Shore?
Mr. Shore.
Yeah. We're in the process now of prioritizing, I take it. And so I think that in looking at these things, if we're saying is this one number one at the top of the list? I think the answer is I'd ask legal, is this not absolutely required?
She says it is required.
Right. So it is a top list item. As number two, no packing. Is packing not required? See, these are the things that, you know.
Number one, we haven't left number one.
Yeah, well, we're talking about prioritizing, and I'm just
No,
thinking.
we haven't finished discussing number one. We have to decide, is 10% our number?
What we're trying to do is discuss them, and then in the process of discussing and accepting, we hope that we would prioritize it. We can chew gum and do things. Madam Attorney, please. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, so Mr. Sure is correct. Number one is obviously legally required. Number two is as well, although I would encourage you to use some of the language that you've seen in some of the other criteria lists from other cities and even ours from last time, which just simply says that the districts will be drawn in accordance with all applicable laws, because packing is obviously not in compliance with the law, and neither is cracking. So, I mean, it would be, unless you're going to take this with a specific percentage, then I would recommend that you just do the more general language, because that's a catch-all that really needs to be in there anyway.
Okay. So let's go back to one then, and.
May I say one more thing?
Yes.
On the no retrogression, I just wanted to reiterate something that I had said in previous meetings. Remember that this language is specific to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which is no longer applicable. So in terms of it being absolutely 100% required, it's not, but that's not to say that you can't include it. And just as a reminder, no retrogression means that the definition is that you don't put minorities in any worse position than they are with the current map. So I think that's definitely something that you can consider including, should include perhaps, in terms of equity, but just remember that that is not actually a Voting Rights Act requirement.
But that doesn't mean, as you've said, that we shouldn't do it.
Correct.
Just because we don't have to go to the Justice Department for pre-clearance.
Yes, ma'am.
But that is something that's essential to the nature of what we're trying to do. And, okay. Can we go back to number one?
Can I ask a clarifying question for Attorney? Is the 10% the number in the law?
10% is considered a safe harbor, so it is the maximum. A lot of times people will try to hit more, something more closer to 5. But 10 would be a maximum. And, to the point that's been made previously, we do have areas that are going to explode in growth over the next 10 years. So, the 10% is a safe number.
So that means 5 on each side? 4, okay. All right. Are we?
Chair?
Yes, ma'am.
This is Teresa. Would you clarify your comment about 5 on each side? I'm sorry.
Well, the deviation, if it was, so the goal is 10, so it may be 5, maybe a little short on this side, or.
Okay.
I've
got it. Okay, thank you.
Maybe I'm not articulate enough to explain it, but.
No, it's fine. That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So are we at a point where we can, we've concluded our discussion on one and we can proceed to a vote? Okay. All in favor of number one, approximately equal size, which means the population of largest districts plus or minus 10% more than the population of the smallest district. All in favor of that? Raise your hand. Groovy. Do we have a motion to accept that one?
Motion to accept number one.
Ms. Scott, and a second?
Second.
Mr. Shore is seconding? Great.
Yes.
All right. All in favor, would you raise your hand? Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Great. Mr. Bradshaw, got you. Thank you. Now, I just want to ask, is this a number one priority for us? Or do we want to go and discuss all the
Legal
the first four
requirements.
and then, I'm sorry?
It's a legal requirement, so to me, that's immaterial of us making it the number one priority.
Is that, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page.
We could say it's the last priority, but they still have to do it.
Okay. Mr. Shore and then Ms. Ayala.
Yeah, I'm wondering where in this list we should place, or if we should place at the very top of the list, the general language that council recommended about just compliance with the legal requirements in general.
So you're suggesting that we suggest that a number one priority be that we suggest to the council that they meet all of the legal requirements?
Right, I mean, the legal requirements of the Constitution and laws of the United States and the state of Texas and the charter of the city of Fort Worth, something like that, whatever
Okay.
the council would come up with.
Well, here's council now. Council and then Ms. Scott.
Yes, in Mr. Costa's presentation, he gave you all the Sacramento redistricting criteria from 2010. And I like how they did it, and I would suggest that you all do something similar where
Page 8.
Yeah, page 8, slide 16, which has some requirements that are equally important, because you've got the districts in equal population, meeting the law. Those are obviously, you can't really put one in front of the other. They're both required. But then, and they're number 4, then that's where they have those that they've put in order of priority. So I would encourage y'all to kind of do something like that, where you've got, there are some of those that, like the ones that you took first, you could do those in order of priority, but the equal population, meeting the law, those are both equally important.
What's your pleasure, Task Force? The council has offered an alternative. We're looking at the Sacramento. This is on page 8.
I like the Sacramento outline.
I second that.
I do too.
How many of us? Ms. Kennedy, how do you feel about Sacramento? Okay. You for it? Okay. Ms. Ayala, are you still with us? Okay. Mr. Shore, are you? Okay. Ms. Ayala, thank you.
I'm for it, but I think we should substitute the state of Texas for California. I don't think that would go over
That
very
would be,
well.
that would be helpful. Thank you. That's a great observation, Mr. Shore.
I do think we need to tell the council what that compliance means, with due respect to no packing, fragmentation, no even if, well, retrogression is not required, but it could be diluting. So I do think we need to say, comply with the U.S. Constitution, Voting Rights Act, Texas Constitution, other applicable laws, and somehow say no packing, no cracking. And I would even say no retrogression, because if you do retrogress, that's not fair. I mean, it may not be required by the law, but it's really not fair. So I would say that, at least. I would say the same thing that Sacramento has, MAP complies with U.S. Constitution, Voting Rights Act, Texas Constitution, other applicable laws, with no packing, and no cracking, and no retrogression.
Retrogression, yes, okay. There has been an amendment by Mr. Espino.
Yes.
Ms. Ayala, you're for that?
I agree with that. I was looking at it, reading it, and I agree with that point, a suggestion as well.
Great. Mr. Bradshaw? All right. All right. All in favor of, wait a minute, I got to go. I'm sorry. Yes, Mr. Costa.
Just a minor point of clarification. Mr. Espino, I think, has suggested that we adopt a language about compliance with different legal provisions with no packing, and I think the term packing is commonly understood. The term cracking, however, may not be commonly understood.
What about fragmentation?
The term that we used before, yes, fragmentation may be a synonym.
Yes.
That's more commonly understood than cracking. So packing, no fragmentation, no retrogression.
I'm good with that.
Okay. Ms. Ayala, you're good. Ms. Kennedy, Mr. Bradshaw, Mr. Williams, Mr. Shore. Great observation, Mr. Costa. That's why you're here with us today, okay? Good. All right. Now let's see if we can put this into a package that we can all agree upon. Got so many pages here, I've lost my way here. Okay. We're at number 2, or is it?
No, didn't we include 2 in that? What
What we're doing is we're taking 2 and 4, 3 and well, we haven't really talked about 3, but I mean, I think we're talking about 2 and 4, right? And we'll come back to 3, and I think we've already voted on 1. So, yeah, and the language that I had suggested was MAP complies, taking Sacramento with U.S. Constitution, Voting Rights Act, Texas Constitution, and other applicable laws with no packing, no fragmentation, and no retrogression.
No retrogression. Yeah. Does everybody understand that? So we're combining 2 and 4. Any other discussion? Great. All in favor of the combination of combining 2 and 4 to comply with the U.S. Constitution and all applicable laws? No cracking, no fragmentation, no retrogression. Would you raise your hand? Great. Can we have a motion to accept that one?
So move.
Second?
Second?
Mr. Shure, seconds?
Yes, yes.
All in favor, raise your hand. Thank you much. We're ready to move on, Ms. Kayser? Yes, ma'am. Okay. All right, so let's go back to number 3. Now, are we agreed that 2 and 4, I'm just trying to see where we are on the priority list here. So that would be number 1, wouldn't it? Or is that a number 1 priority? It's at the top.
I mean, you have to comply with the law. And
Yeah, you got to comply with the law. That's why I was saying that would be the intro to our criteria is number 1. Okay? 2 and 4, okay. All right, number 3. The minimum number of minority opportunity districts with combined minority populations greater or less of 50% in proportion to the city's combined minority population. Double speak, but it's open for discussion.
We have to be careful because we cannot use race as a sole criteria to create council districts. So I think what we need to say is council should consider drawing opportunity districts that reflect the continuing diversity of its population, and then leave it at that. And then as we go through the public process, there's also legal requirements. As Ms. Guzman had pointed out, a minority opportunity district is a term of art in the law. Basically, you look at citizen voting age population greater than 50%. And as I indicated previously, the African-American community in districts 5 and 8 are not at 50% plus. They're in their 40s. So I think we need to leave that way, because there's been a tradition of 2 council districts that have always elected an African-American representative. So I think we need to be careful with number 3, how we word it. And as Mr. Scher pointed out, and has happened in District 2, just because you create a district, that doesn't mean those folks, basically, you give that community an opportunity to select a candidate of their choice. And that candidate can be African-American, Hispanic, or Anglo, but you're giving that community an opportunity to minimally influence the elections, and they pick who they want to represent them.
Well, one of the great things, this is just my observation, that we have, our housing patterns have changed which makes, in reality, more opportunity districts if people really concentrated and voted as they should, as apparently they did in this election season. So if we kept that practice up, we would have more opportunity districts, so we could elect people who are, or at least people would have a viability of electing the person they would they choose. Discussion, Mr. Shore?
I think that I agree with Mr. Espino. I do so with a great deal of remaining concern, however, about how this is going to play out. And so I think that this is going to be, I suggest that we leave it in as a preliminary finding. And I believe that we do so with full knowledge that we are going to get a ton of public comment on this specific subject. I cannot imagine there not being specialists in this area of practice and special interest groups who, with a lot of experience in voting rights matters, who will not want to weigh in and add their 2 cents worth on the wording of this. So I go along with the language as worded by Mr. Espino and simply note that we will hear more about this later.
Mr. DeVito?
Can legal recommend better verbiage?
Well, I had come up with some, but it included the term minority opportunity districts, which I understand is it may be off the table, but I just kept it very simple and said, create minority opportunity districts in compliance with federal law, because you do have to dig down into the data to get there.
Yeah, I like that. That's simple
I
enough.
like that.
Yeah, I'm okay with that too.
I am too.
I want to make sure everybody hears and understands.
Create minority opportunity districts in compliance with federal law.
I like it.
Much better.
I like that.
Discussion?
I like it better. I would like to perhaps add something that in furtherance of the commission that dealt with race relations, it to better reflect the diversity of our city. I would like to say a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a good amendment,
agree.
Mr. Scher, to further reflect the diversity of the city of Fort Worth. That's excellent recommendation, Mr. Scher.
Right.
So we're on consensus. Madam Counsel, would you read that again with the additions?
Yes, create minority opportunity districts in compliance with federal law to further reflect the diversity of the city.
And Ms. Scott brought up a good point, the growing diversity, because the city is getting more diverse, the growing diversity of the city. I think that shows the trend line.
Further, the growing diversity?
Diversity, yes.
That back one more time, Ms. Guzman.
Create minority opportunity districts in compliance with federal law to further reflect the growing diversity of the city.
I like that.
I like that.
You like that? Great.
It's beautiful. That's perfect.
Mr. Bradshaw, Mr. Williams, I just want to get a sense, yay or nay? Okay. All in favor of creating minority opportunity districts in compliance with federal law to further, oh, wait a minute. Reflect, that's the word I'm missing, the growing diversity of the city. All in favor? Raise your hand. Great, can I have a motion to accept that?
Motion, Teresa?
Ms. Ayala and Mr.
Sure.
Sure, great, thank you much. We're in favor of that? Raise your hand. Grovey, thank you.
Madam Chair, I do have one more topic I want to bring up, and respected task force members may disagree with me, but citizens have come and asked to at least recommend or consider recommending to the council an independent redistricting commission. Obviously, even if we recommend that, the chance of the council doing that is not likely, but I would at least like to have that for discussion, and I'm in favor of recommending to the council that they consider an independent redistricting commission, because I saw how well it worked in Austin. However, I'm open to comments and discussion from other task force members, but that is a best government practice, and I know the council is not considering that at this moment, and if I'm outvoted, that's fine, but I do want the record to reflect that I'm in favor of an independent redistricting commission.
Discussion, members?
I agree with that recommendation as well. That seems to be the feedback. This is Teresa Ayala. The feedback that from the community that they'd like to see this. I think it was something that it's been a consideration for some time, and it seemed to be very successful in other cities as well. So I do support that as a consideration as well.
Mr. Shore?
I agree with that. But I don't think that we're not recommending it clearly we're talking about, we were asked to recommend criteria and procedures for all future redistricting in the city of Fort Worth for decades to come. And so with that in mind, I agree with that. I just don't think that should be we should try to make that a part of this current redistricting, because we should say that maybe for the beginning in the years after the 2030 census, there should be an independent redistricting commission created to handle redistricting after the next census, the 2030 census. But I would take off the table any suggestion that we have an independent redistricting commission for this upcoming redistricting.
Mr. Williams?
Yes, I will just say amen to what Mr. Sharon just mentioned. I do not feel that it's necessary. They have assigned us to give recommendations and come up with proposals for them and for the city. I think that's what they have asked us to do. But I think that maybe the next time that this comes up, independent redistricting committee may be appropriate, but right now I don't think it's appropriate, and I will concur that this is not a recommendation from this committee to the city council. City council wants to do something like that. They have all the right and privileges that they can go ahead and do.
Mr. DeVito?
I'm not clear on the purpose of the task force if we were just going to hand it off to an independent commission. Can you help me with that?
I mean, I think the council clearly, there was a race and cultural task force. The race and cultural task force did recommend that the council consider an independent redistricting commission. The council opted not to go forward, so they created this task force. Now, they did say procedures and criteria. An independent redistricting commission is a procedure, right? Because it is another mechanism by which you can do redistricting. So I don't think we're outside the charge. Council may not like the recommendation, and it's certainly in their purview not to consider the criteria, because I've had experience on this when I was on the council. Council recommended to amend the charter prior to the 2016 elections, go to a council pay, go to three-year terms, staggered terms, and the council split on that and go to 10 single-member districts. So 4 council members did not support the recommendation of that task force to go to 10, but the voters went ahead and passed that. They rejected council pay, 3-year terms, staggered terms, but they did, and maybe I'm wrong about staggered terms, I don't remember, but they did reject council pay and longer terms, and then they did barely approve 10-1. It was a hot issue going from 8 to 10-1. All I'm saying is that I don't mind backing up the race and cultural task force, and we don't have to, and if I'm allowed to, I mean, I guess I am, my motion would be to recommend to council that they consider again creating an independent redistricting commission. That's all my motion would say, because I do think that's the best government practice, and waiting for another census, frankly, being a former council member, when they draw the maps, we are eliminating some of these criteria where they do buddy mandering, but we are more diverse as a city, and I think an independent redistricting commission gets us even further along in that diverse representation. But that's my personal view. Reasonable minds can disagree, and the council may not opt to follow. They didn't follow the recommendation of the Race and Cultural Task Force to consider. I would just like to throw that out there for this task force, and I'm happy to be outvoted if I make a motion, but I really feel strongly about it.
Let me, I'd just like to make a couple of comments. I personally am not sure that the independent redistricting task force is going to get us where we want to go. I say that in that it's been my experience, once you do these kind of organizations, they change. They become politicized, and they can go to the left, they can go to the right. And what we are trying to do is to make sure that there's transparency, correct, in the drawing of the redistricting lines. So I don't know if that's the mechanism. Clearly, something needs to be done. And what that mechanism is, I don't know. It may be an independent redistricting task force, and I don't know. But one of the things that really is apparent to me, that this has got to be something that the residents of Fort Worth want and know about and work to achieve. If this is something we don't have, I don't see a hue and cry out there about it. There are certain segments, I say Mr. Miller is here, who has been a champion of it for quite some time. But I just would hope that we not do something as a knee-jerk, but really have a considered opinion. That is not within our purview as a task force. That's not what clearly the council this time around heard what the Race and Cultural Task Force did, and what did they say? Okay, they recommended that the city do a charter amendment to study doing a redistricting task force. If this is something this task force wants to do, then by George, we'll make a recommendation. If it's not, I just want us to do it in a considered way. Does that make sense? Clearly, something's got to be done.
I've got a comment on that.
Sure.
I think that in some ways we are a compromise, that we're a half measure towards some independence, right? Having citizens on a task force that are devoted only to the criteria is kind of a halfway measure to get to some level of independence without going completely to an independent commission, right? And I guess my question is, do we know if this worked or not? And I kind of want, even though we're on the commission, on the task force, I kind of want to see how this goes. If we're able to make an impact, if we're able to talk to the community, if we're able to get greater transparency through this function, and whether or not they take it to heart in drawing these maps. And we really don't know as we sit here right now. And I feel like by recommending an independent task force commission, we're saying we can't get it done as in our current role, so we need to recommend that we go that further step to get to an independent commission. And that may be the case. We may need to do that, but I don't think we know that right now. And I think that's a little bit of throwing in the towel.
I agree completely. I don't want to just hand it off. It may end up getting handed off later on, but I don't think I'm not in favor of doing that right now.
But if we have our committee hearings and there's a hue and cry out there from rank and file residents of Fort Worth, and they're saying, by George, we've got to have an independent redistricting commission, we have to, I'm hoping that we reflect the will of the residents.
I think the council would probably pretty clearly hear that at that point and move ahead with an independent commission.
Ms. Scott, I think you.
No, I was just going to say, so that the commission would be the body that draws the lines. So what we're saying is that, because I've heard from the community as well, that it should be an independent commission. So I'm kind of, rather than having to fully decide now, if we have all of the, community input and all of the, going out and they say independent commission, can we then add it at that point?
I believe so, Mr. Costa, and the attorney, counsel. Can we? I hear nods of heads.
And we all hear it, then, we can then take a vote on it and say whether or not to add it and ask the council to, create an independent redistricting commission and use that and,
Ms. Kennedy, Ms. Ayala, Mr. Bradshaw, Mr. Williams, Mr. Schur. Love to hear your comments.
I'd rather wait a little longer and hear more from the community when we're out in the community. And also next month, when we talk to the council ourselves and get, a better feel from the council about this. I mean, we haven't presented any of our preliminary findings to the council. They may come back to us next month and go, wow, this is amazing, we love this. Or they may come back to us and go, this is ridiculous, you've not done a good job, and we want to just, go off on our own, and that would give us, some idea of whether or not they're going to listen to our recommendations in the end, or if we did need to, go further recommend more independence.
Great.
So I think we're premature in that personally.
Ms. Scott, then Mr. Bradshaw, and Mr. Shore.
So I just want to add to that there were some of us who were shocked that we weren't drawing the lines on this task force. So some of us came into this thinking that we would be the body that would draw the lines, and we're shocked. So recommending an independent redistricting commission is not far from where we walked in the door and thought who we were. So
Great. Mr. Bradshaw, then Mr. Shore.
So I'm fine if we wait to hear from the public. Honestly, if you read the Race and Culture Task Force recommendation on governance about this, that was the task force that they had asked for to be created, was supposed to go out and solicit feedback from the public in the first place to decide if we should have an independent redistricting commission. So if we go out to the public and they start saying something, I guess maybe we're not going to initiate it. Maybe we will, but we'll start a dialogue, right? And we'll hear from them, and and then we'll go from there. So I think we all have heard from people, and it'll be interesting when we decide to pull in more comment.
Right, Mr. Shore. Thank you.
Well, I'm still wavering on the subject, but I think that from a political perspective, I would like to hear from those on this commission or this task force who really have more experience with the council politics to explain, if they may, why it would be better to make this recommendation to.
Mr. Shore, you're on mute.
Have I been on mute the whole time?
No, not all the time.
I don't know what happened. I didn't do anything. Okay, so why politically would it be a good thing to recommend now, even if we think ultimately that's where we're going to end up, rather than waiting until we get the citizen input?
Well, what I'm hearing is lack of consensus. So I'm not going to make a motion. I just want the record to reflect that, we don't, in my view, to me, and reasonable minds can disagree, independent redistricting commission is best practices, but I hear the rest of the task force members, and I'm not going to divide the task force. I just want to make sure that the record reflects that I and Ms. Ayala and anybody else that wants to weigh in at least issue a minority preliminary finding that these task force members still support the recommendation of the Race and Cultural Task Force to create an independent redistricting commission. And I understand there's still a lot of uncertainty in this task force. Everyone here is a dedicated citizen with great public service, but and I respect the views, and obviously we don't have consensus on that. So I'm not gonna make the motion, but I do want in the report or the preliminary finding council to at least let the record reflect that I and Ms. Ayala and whoever else wants to join us, that we still support the recommendation of the Race and Cultural Task Force.
Great, duly noted. And one of the things that I hope this points up, task force members, the importance of our forums, our ability to hear people in our neighborhoods. That, to me, that is the heart and soul of what we are tasked to do, and to bring that information back to our council so that they too can make informed decisions. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Spino. I appreciate your...
Thanks all of y'all for your spirited comment and debate. Appreciate all of your insights. And I'm gonna have to run, unfortunately, busy schedules, but I will follow the rest of the meeting online. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm joining Espino.
So,
I have to join Mr. Espino
Madam
in
Chair.
that.
yes.
Yeah.
I spoke to Fernando, and what we'd like to do is have Fernando come back to the podium and go over the criteria that you all want to put in your final report to make sure that we have it in the right order and the correct wording. And so, because there's...
And committee, I do want to, I hope you beg your patience because Mrs. Gutt? Goot, I'm sorry. Where's Goot? What we're going to do, this is all tying into our hearings that are upcoming, and that we really do need you, if you can have a little patience. Mr. Fernando Costa?
And Madam Chair, I know it is running a little bit late, but after Fernando finishes, perhaps a quick 5-minute break would be good, and then we can come back and hear Ms. Goot and then our public presentations, if anybody would be
You
interested.
guys want to break afterwards?
After we hear from Fernando.
I apologize, but quite literally, the pharmacy in Heritage closes at 7 o'clock, and if I don't pick up my 84-year-old father's prescription, that's just not a good thing.
Go home.
So I
No need for you
apologize.
going home.
Likewise, I'm going to have to leave. I'm going to trust y'all to do the order right.
If we need to move meetings to 2:30 or somehow.
Well, I'm supposed to be on a webinar that started at 6 o'clock.
I understand.
Go ahead, Mr. Costa.
Yes,
Why
ma'am.
you got us?
I think the question has to do with the priority of the 10 criteria that you are presenting to the city council. And I don't think that you have actually discussed priorities 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera. You've said certain items ought to be high priority, certain items are lower priority. And so if I might suggest, you have 5 high priority items and 5 lower priority items, not distinguishing within each group of 5. So the 5 high priority items are approximately equal size, is number 1. Number 2 is compliance with the law, using the language that we're drawing from Sacramento as revised. Number 3 is the opportunity districts. Again, I can recite the exact language, but just to summarize. Number 4 is communities of interest. Number 5 is contiguous territory. So those 5, I think you considered to be high priority. The next 5 would be classified as lower priority, but still significant. And those would include number 6, compactness. Number 7, identifiable boundaries. Number 8, whole voting precincts. Number 9, whole census blocks and block groups. And number 10, do not consider place of residence. So again, we'll elaborate on the actual language, but that's how we understood you to be classifying high priority versus lower priority.
Just as a moment, I didn't hear continuous territory.
Contiguous would be number 5 among the high priority. Contiguous territory.
Yes, that was number in the first top 5 that he mentioned it, contiguous. Okay.
So if that reflects your intent, we will present it in that way.
Great. Ms. Ayala and Mr. Short, everybody's comfortable with what he's at?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Great. Mr. Williams and Mr. Bradshaw, good. All right. Thank you, Mr. Costa.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, this is Ms. Ayala. I'm sorry, I have to drop. I'm running late for another meeting as well. I apologize.
Okay, understood.
Thank you, ma'am.
Great.
Enjoy the conversation.
Okay. Can we move to Ms. Goot pretty quickly? Sure. Thank you.
Let me get her presentation now, sorry.
Gone to? Okay.
Okay. But first I gotta share it, so hang on.
Is your presentation in our packet? No,
Yes.
I didn't get it. Okay.
It should be in there.
It says Redistricting Task Force Communications and Outreach. Okay, you can go on to the second slide. Okay, I'm going to give you an overview of just our recommendations for doing our communications and outreach about the redistricting effort. I'm recommending that we do this in 2 phases. Phase 1 would be the education, which is telling people what redistricting is, why it's important, and what the process will be. And then phase 2 would be the public engagement piece, how people can get involved, what are the different ways that they can provide their input, and then the 5 meetings throughout the city, and I'll talk more about that later. Next. So these are some of the ways that we'll do our outreach and our engagement, and I want to point out that everything that we do in English and Spanish and any other languages that are requested. Also, all of the information that's on our website can be translated into 52 different languages using a translation tool. So we do have it accessible to a lot of different people. We will put something in our water bill insert. We will also have it in City Times, which is our electronic newsletter. We currently have about 330,000 subscribers to that. We also send out district newsletters through our electronic newsletter. And we're going to add, we have 170 different topics that people can subscribe to. And we're going to add redistricting as a topic so that anyone who's interested in getting regular updates, they can subscribe to that, and then they'll get those specific information sent to their emails. We also do robocalls, especially when we have meetings coming up, and we do neighborhood outreach. We have databases of faith-based organizations, community groups, and also our neighborhood associations, so we'll be sending the information out to all of those. We will also use social media. The city has about 49,000 Facebook followers. We have 167,000 followers on Twitter and about 248,000 on Nextdoor. So we'll use all of those tools to get the information out. We will also share the post with some of our partner organizations so that we can extend our reach. We're also going to create some videos, which I'll go into more detail, and we will have a hashtag for all of our social media posts to tie it all together. And right now the recommendation is hashtag Fort Worth Redistricting. Next. That's okay. That's okay. No. That's okay.
All right, sorry, there you go.
In addition to social media, we have our new fortworthtexas.gov website, and we will have a page on the website, Fort Worth Redistrict. It will be live on December 1st. It will include all the task force information, downloadable information from the meetings, and any informational videos, and it will also have links to the maps that we've been getting from our planning and data analytics department. Next. Right now we're planning on doing 2 videos. The first one will be a Redistricting 101 video, a high-level overview of the redistricting process, and why it's important, and the fact that it will be adding 2 new council seats here in Fort Worth. The second video will be a little bit more in-depth to talk about the task force and your charge and the criteria that you talked about today and your recommendations. And then it will be, we want to include interviews with the chair and the mayor, and we will also have a way for people after they view the video to provide us input and information through email or an online tool. So right now our timeline for phase 1, in December we'll be launching the Redistricting 101 video, the website launch, and the public education campaign. And then in January, we'll incorporate the 101 video into the second video and have that available to not only promote the task force work, but also to encourage people to attend our public meetings. As Fernando mentioned earlier, our original plan was to do district meetings, and then we talked about doing geographic. But with the uptick in COVID-19 tests, we don't feel like in-person meetings is probably the best thing to do. And so we are planning or recommending perhaps doing the first seminar, which would be the Redistricting 101, the first week of January. And it will be, we could film it in our studio. It would be live. People could participate virtually and provide input and questions. And then we would also record it to show later. Following the seminar, we're recommending that we do 3 virtual public meetings And we have some tentative dates of January 11th, 19th, and 21st. Those would be in the evening, and people would be able to participate through WebEx. They could also, if they don't have access to a computer, they could also just listen in by calling into the meeting and participating that way. And we would also record those and have those posted online. So that's the speed version.
Ms. Gutt,
Are there any
the
questions?
dates again, January 11th?
11th, the 19th, and the 21st. And that's a Monday, a Tuesday, and a Thursday.
And at what time?
We're recommending 6 o'clock, just because that allows people, to get home from work, and probably recommend that it's about an hour and a half long. And we're thinking the beginning of the meeting would be that overview about what the task force is doing, the criteria that you're recommending, and then allow people to provide feedback and input.
Are we going to do any of this in Spanish?
We can do one in Spanish. We can add that, yes. And I can get with Councilmember Espino. We did, one of our budget virtual meetings was in Spanish, so we can definitely do that. I would recommend, like he said, that we do one in Spanish separately, instead of trying to do the English and Spanish, because then the meeting starts to get very long when you're doing everything in both languages. So we can do that.
And I will,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'll send out Michelle's presentation. I forgot to include it in your handout, so I'll send this out to you so you all can have this.
Great, thank you. Ms. Scott?
The video will be available in December, and it'll be on the website, or how will we be able to access the
Well,
video?
it'll be on the website, but we'll also be pushing it out through social media. And typically what we do whenever we run a story in our city news, we then also share it on Nextdoor, on Facebook, and on Twitter. And so we'll hit all of those platforms with the video. And I can also share the link with all of you. So if you want to, share it on your social media channels, you can do that too.
Just out of curiosity, how long do you think the video is going to be?
My recommendation for the Redistricting 101 is that it be very short.
Yes.
And that is, it gives the very high level view. We're doing it all, it's all going to be with graphics and animation. And so my goal is to make it very engaging and to get people interested in the topic. And then we'll direct them to the places where they can sign up for more information. That second video will be a lot more detailed and longer, but I think for the initial one, in order to just make people familiar with the topic, it needs to be very short, because everyone has a very short attention span on social media.
Yes, and to make it appealing to people, because if you can use it during a neighborhood meeting, which would be ideal. Ms. Scott? Okay.
We have our community engagement office, and they have regular contact with all of the registered neighborhood associations in the city. And a lot of them typically have had their annual meetings at the beginning of the year in January. A lot of them are doing virtual meetings now, and our staff is actually helping to facilitate some of those. So we'll be sharing that with them and asking them to share it with their members through our neighborhood association contacts.
Thank you, Ms. Gutt. I think one of the, as I said before, I think one of the great things about this task force is our reaching out to our neighbors and to residents of Fort Worth who have no, as my mom would say, people who are in woo-woo land, who don't understand, who don't know. This would be a great opportunity for them to learn about what we're doing with redistricting and how they can participate. That's the key to it.
And we do have a group of community organizations that we initially involved in the Race and Culture Task Force, and then we also worked with a lot of them during our census complete count committee. And so I will share that list with you all. If there's any organizations that you all think are missing, if you would give me that information, we would gladly add them to our list. And that's a group that we'll be sharing the information with too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions of Ms. Gutt, task force members? Okay, thank you much. We have a long list, Ms. Kayser, of folks that are here to make presentations to the task force.
Yes, that is true.
Can we get to that now? Because
Absolutely.
We're 3 hours and 31 minutes into this.
All right, so let me, that's not what I wanted. Our first one will be Bruce Miller. Thank you, Mr. Miller, and you will have 3 minutes, and I'll be your timekeeper.
Can you all hear me? Well, Chairman Miller knows where I'm coming from. At the October meeting, Mr. Costello gave a clear and compelling presentation of what was achieved in Austin through the establishment of an independent commission. This is the procedure that the Mayor's Race and Culture Task Force recommended that the City of Fort Worth consider in its 2018 report to the city. Mr. Costello explained the mechanism for creating an IRC. He showed how it resulted in growing political engagement in Austin.
Mr. Miller, if you could get a little closer to that microphone.
And resulted in 72 candidates running for 10 positions. Thank you. Part of the charge of the Fort Worth Redistricting Task Force is to recommend redistricting procedures to the City Council. Therefore, it was puzzling and disappointing that the chair appeared to rule out any consideration of this possibility for the Fort Worth before the task force members even had the opportunity to hear Mr. Costello's presentation. Maybe that's changed, especially since at the previous meeting, some task force members were speaking up in favor of the approach. This occurred in the October meeting as well, where Mr. Espino, Mr. Bradshaw spoke in favor of an IRC, and Mr. Shore pointed out that this was the direction that other cities were following. Nearly all of the public comments following the October meeting strongly favored the creation of an IRC. Today, 14 states are engaged in creating either independent or nonpartisan commissions. We believe it would be a mistake for the task force to turn its back on this promising approach. It will lose credibility with the public since independent redistricting is now coming to their attention. As part of its recommendations, the current task force could easily include at least the consideration of the creation of an independent commission. This would not be a serious distraction from its goals of choosing criteria and public outreach. Regardless, independent redistricting should be included as a component of any outreach efforts. Otherwise, the present group will be painting an incomplete picture of what's available and occurring elsewhere and losing credibility in the process. And this is already taking place. Citizens for Independent Redistricting hopes that you have the tenacity and courage to follow this path. Either way, we urge the task force to include in its report that it heard numerous public comments at these open meetings in support of an IRC, and that not one person spoke in favor of the council retaining that power. Our city council members deserve to know the depth of support that still exists for an independent commission in Fort Worth, and that the idea did not die with the Race and Culture Task Force. So thank you for your attention.
Mr. Ellison.
Thank you, Ms. Kayser. I'm not going to use my charts. I'm sorry to send you all those charts, but I came here, I was going to speak about the Interstate 820 rule, but you all have dispatched it pretty quickly. My name is Byerwick Ellison, so I'm going to change horses and talk a little bit about a little different topic. I will say that some months ago, I sat across the table from a city council member who gave a very spirited defense of the Interstate 820 rule. I wasn't expecting that. It was kind of a surprise. I thought it was low-hanging fruit and it ought to go, and you have all decided that, and I will be very interested to see how the council receives your recommendation. The arguments went along the lines of what Mr. Schur spoke about, the tensions between the outerlying areas that have homes with high prices and pay a significant amount of property tax versus where the money is spent on the older parts of the inner city. And that, for me, underscored an essential point that when you redistrict, the subtext is also money. You're not just carving up votes, you're also carving up money in the form of taxpayers, in the form of businesses, in the form of developers with projects that are ongoing, and at the most sophisticated level in the realm of donors with deep pockets. So this connection between redistricting and money has a long history. You can look just as recently as this summer when a member of the Los Angeles City Council, Jose Huizar, was arrested by the FBI and charged with 34 counts of accepting up to $1.5 million in illicit monies and gifts. And redistricting was a major part of what enabled him to do this. In the 2012 cycle, he was rewarded with the political patronage of getting a large swath of downtown at Los Angeles that has a lot of ongoing projects, and a couple of other districts were decimated. So this idea of redistricting as a political tool is not theoretical, or the idea of an IRC as good government is not theoretical. It's very practical. And if you read about Mr. Huizar's case, I don't know why you would want to entrust a city council with the sole authority to draw maps without oversight, without transparency, without any other entity involved. So that's kind of my take on independent redistricting commissions. And again, I will be very interested to and hope that they receive your comments and the decisions that you've made today with open arms. Thank you very much.
Mr. Willoughby. Use this one, would be better.
All right, hi, I'm Willoughby in District 5, and the first thing is, I want the cameras on the task force as if I was calling in on the phone. I don't want the cameras on me. I want the people to see the expression of the people of the task force, please. Okay. The first thing, there's so many things here. I do videos myself. They're at City Council every Tuesday night. There's a council meeting. You'll see a video from me about this, okay? First thing off here is that I don't know about y'all, how many of y'all knew about the charter, how many of you voted on it or what, but it was done wrong. The 2016 charter was not advertised. There was no votes. There was less than 1% that voted for 2 more council members. They had 2 more council members for 1% is wrong. Now here's the thing why it wasn't advertised just like this. It wasn't advertised. Right here is a picture I just took a while ago on 30. It's a billboard. The city puts up Fort Worth welcomes NFR, okay? They can pay for that, but they can't put a billboard up for this or when they did the charter. They didn't put them up. Council members use billboards right here. Here's another one, a council member. She's running for council because billboards work, not Facebook, not Nextdoor, and not that. Look at the City Times here. Here's City Times. You know what you got in here? You're under worth knowing. Just a little headline in here. It doesn't have a borderline, doesn't have dates. They have 4 years to put out dates and stuff for people. Okay, they didn't do that. What I'm asking the council now are the task force. We don't trust City Council. That's why you're getting asked for another MIDI. But I'm okay with you if you do what your words say. We work on actions and not words. Words lie. And that's what we're watching right now. You should go before council on the 3rd and tell them to stop this charade. Council has not answered any questions about the 2 members. We've asked for 3 years. I've got 4 questions. They won't answer. What kind of deal is that? This is getting railroaded. If they won't answer 4 freaking questions. In other words, the thing should be put back on the ballot. There's time for 2 more council members. Require 20% of the population to vote for 2 more council members. If 20% don't want to get off the couch and vote for 2 more council members, don't spend $250,000 of taxpayer money for nothing. That's one of the questions I've asked council. How does it benefit us with 2 more? They don't answer. I'm not asking you to answer. I ask council to answer. They don't answer. It doesn't benefit us $250,000. If 20% won't get up and vote for it, we don't need 2 more council members. Put it on the ballot. It will fail. And you won't be redistricting for 2 council members right now. You'll be redistricting fair. Because the way the mayor goes at this, by the amount of people, that's no good. If we brought council members in by the amount of people, we'd do it the same way the police and the fire department. We did this by a vote. Am I in the way? And it wasn't advertised. It's tainted from the beginning. So you put it back on the ballot. You require 20% to vote for 2 more council members, and you put it on billboards. You advertise it first, okay? And then we're on the right track. And there was one other thing I
I'm
wanted.
sorry, your time is up.
My time's up?
Your
Well, that
time
was
is
a
up.
quick 3 minutes, I'll tell you.
That's,
If this goes forward, it's a sin.
okay. I'm going to let Mr. Gibson get up and get our screen back the way we want it. And our next speaker's on the phone, so let me give him a call. Thank you, Jim.
Hello, this is Max.
Yes, you're on the line with the Redistricting Task Force. You can go ahead with your comments.
Okay, thank you for calling back. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Max Krockmall. I'm just calling to urge you to consider your charge of creating a fair process for redistricting. We know from examples of other jurisdictions and a lot of research in the field that the way to do that is through an independent redistricting commission. So I would urge you to resist the political pressure to allow the city council to draw their own districts to their own advantage and instead follow the best practice of democratic governments everywhere and create an independent redistricting commission and report back that the criteria that you want is for the process to be truly independent of political influence and to not allow the politicians to draw their own districts any longer. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
And next up will be Fernando Flores. He's also on the phone.
Hello.
Mr. Flores, this is Mary Kayser. You're on the line with the Redistricting Task Force. So please go ahead with your comments.
Thank you so much. I want to add clarification to what I said on the 22nd of October. And here's my recommendation. I recommend to the Fort Worth City Council Redistricting Task Force that it recommends to the mayor, Betsy Price, and the city council members to please reconsider their decision to oppose citizen independent redistricting. This was one of the recommendations made by the Race and Culture Task Force after a year and a half of public input. The promise was made to the public that all recommendations would be implemented. There is no justification for not implementing this or even considering. There was no discussion at all, and that's my recommendation. They need to open discussions and reconsider their decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next is Pastor Kenneth Jones, who will also be on the phone.
You have reached the voicemail for Pastor Kenneth Jones Jr. He is unable to take your call at the moment.
All right, we'll try him again. Our next speaker is Jackie Cox, and she is here in person. Yes. I will do my, yes, I will do my best here.
I'm Jackie Cox. I moved to Fort Worth in 1956. It was the first time I ever had lived in a place that was totally segregated. I went to all-white schools. When I went to stores, there were signs that said colored and white for the drinking fountains and the restrooms. I grew up in a world that I thought was really cruel and pointlessly cruel and exclusionary. By the time we got to 1965 and got the Voting Rights Act, and those things which were put into place after the Voting Rights Act that lead to your mandatory considerations for redistricting, I had hopes that we would make progress more rapid than we had made, but we did make some progress. This last year has been a discouraging time. Once again, I saw people with guns in the streets, menacing those who were demonstrating. There are so many hurts to be bound up now that what happens with redistricting can be really crucial to how we move forward or whether we move forward in the years to come. This last year, in 2019, when Tatiana Jefferson was shot and killed by a police officer in her home, there was a huge reaction in Fort Worth, and I think it was a justified reaction. And then we had the pandemic, and people were out less until there was a viral video of George Floyd gasping, "I can't breathe," with a police officer with his knee on his neck. And there was again an outcry. We need justice and we need change. But what might have been, well, what we hoped for would be more change in the city of Fort Worth and the way it runs its police department got kind of muted because the pandemic drove everybody home and we had meetings online instead of in person. And the Police Officers Association gave a lot of money. I don't know if you can see this chart, but they do have a copy of it as well. Committee for Public Safety Fort Worth Police Officers Association has what is called a Political Action Committee, a PAC. They get money deducted from their paychecks at the city of Fort Worth, and that money goes into a Political Action Committee fund, and money then goes to the city council members. Ms. Price got in 2020 $15,000. Mr. Moon got $15,000.
Ms.
Gina
Cox, your
Bivens,
time is
Janice
up.
Jordan, Kellyanne Gray all got $15,000.
Ms. Cox, your time is up.
This contract was entered not so long after, it was in August of this year, just about the time the city budget came out, and the police officers got their pay raise. Many other departments.
Your time is
in
up,
the
Ms.
city
Cox.
had layoffs.
Your 3 minutes is up.
Okay, but that's it. You see it. We need independent redistricting.
Our next speaker is Tanya Carter. I believe she is here with us. Good evening. You have 3 minutes.
Hi, my name is Tanya Carter. This is my first time speaking publicly at a meeting. I would like to address the task force as it pertains to redistricting. If you take in consideration with your findings, from my understanding, it's very limited with the criteria you all had to deal with. If you would consider District 3 and House District 90, which is the neighborhood formerly known as Lake Como, Texas, before gentrification, and how redistricting affects me as an individual. And sitting in the meeting, it was discussed, and from what I can comprehend, it's not based on votes. It's not based on trying to put all Republicans in one district. It's not based on trying to add additional seats for a stronger Hispanic voice. It's just based on equal, separating evenly all of the districts. And I would, if some kind of way, if y'all can figure out under one of those bulletins, how y'all can figure out not to chop up Como anymore. We can't be chopped up anymore. And as a result of redistricting, okay, and all of these, what you call them, $12 million housing development grants and everything, in homes way above than the average income of the individual that lives in that neighborhood, is forcing us out. It's forcing people like me out that the average income is $2,000 a month or below. Beautifying the neighborhood with all the trees and revitalizing Corn Street and reimagining Fort Worth and all this, that, and the other with townhomes, condominiums, and everything, shops that people in the neighborhood won't be able to shop in. I think it's a disgrace. I just learned about what y'all just been talking about, an individual review board as it comes to redistricting in order for citizens to have an equal say and X out Madam Mayor and different city council members who may have a vested interest in drawing lines a certain kind of way for their favor or benefit, whatever it is, more standard or their political benefit, whatever it is. I don't like it. I don't have any proof on what I'm saying. All I think I have to do is walk out of my door, off of my porch every day and look around me, and it lets me know what's going on. Como has been a traditionally strong voting bloc in Fort Worth, a traditionally Democratic voting bloc. It has been chopped up, chopped up, chopped up. We have less than $5,000, people in our neighborhood of a traditionally, historically black neighborhood through gentrification. Other people are coming in, and all this old redistricting for Bessie Price to lobby for other businesses to come into the community. That's what all that's for. And now if y'all keep on chopping up, whatever y'all do, just don't touch House District 90 and District 3. Chop up the oven. Go on, put the south, the inside 820 at 820 back in there and put the leftovers over in there. Don't bother us. We can't.
And then we have Jeff Harper.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Harper?
Yes.
Yes, this is Mary Kayser. You're on the line with the Redistricting Task Force to make your comments.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Jeff Harper. I'm a board member with the League of Independent Voters, and also was a former resident of Fort Worth. I had a property on Hemp Hill there for about 20 years, and so very familiar with Fort Worth politics, and expect to be a resident again before too long. Anyway, one of the things that I wanted to stress was absolutely favor an independent citizens redistricting commission like exists in Austin or something customized for Fort Worth. One of my colleagues worked very closely on the effort to adopt the one in the ICRC in Austin in 2015. And I think if you were to take a consensus view of citizens, I don't think anybody would describe it as a disaster. And I know that her name is Linda Curtis, who co-led the effort with Peck Young and others. This was a joint effort, a very diverse coalition that spanned far right to far left, would stand up and voice support for an independent redistricting commission in Fort Worth. I wrote a lengthy letter that seems to ramble in different directions apart from redistricting, but the key points that I wanted to make in that letter, and the reason I went off on the tangent about the credit limit of the United States and so forth, was to stress the importance of two things. Number one, fair process in government, and number two, a strong safety net. We face some challenges in this nation like we have never faced before. So every time you cast a vote concerning government process,
keep in mind how it will play out in the street. And some of the old insiders games just won't fit the bill anymore. People will resent that. And always appreciate, by the way, one final comment, the goodwill that I've detected Fort Worth officials over the years. I think it's generally a lot of people up there. And Fernando Costa in particular. Great to see Fernando in action again. Okay?
Thank you for your comments.
You bet. Thank you.
Well, thank you much. And I always like to hear what people have to say. That's when you really get when the rubber meets the road, when people come up and express their opinion. That's democracy in action. All right. Are there any other items that we need to discuss beyond our, and to thank everyone that participated tonight and made a statement. That is absolutely great. Mr. Shore?
Yeah, I had one comment, and that is that so far, when it comes down to discussion, we have discussed numerous criteria. We have not discussed procedures. And when I say we have not discussed procedures, there was one procedure that I mentioned in my email that dealt with map making. It was a procedure that was cited by a court in North Carolina, which had dealt with having to remedy some really bad districting. But in sending the redistricting process back to the legislators who had so blatantly gerrymandered the districts, the court basically stated that all of their map-making deliberations had to be done basically in public. We had last meeting, we did have a speaker from the League of Women Voters who had a proposal that would have gone much, much further. And that proposal that she stated was that the council members not even be allowed to talk to anyone about redistricting other than in the public presence. I thought that went quite a bit too far, but I did want to point out that procedures to be followed by the council during the redistricting process have not been discussed yet. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Shore, and you're absolutely right, even though we have tangentially discussed the procedures when we went through them at our first meeting. We talked about them, but I think what we're trying to, the criteria, I think, is the crux of what we needed to get through in order to get to procedure. And I think tonight's session, tonight's 4-hour and 3-minute session, I might add, has helped us get there, I think, pretty much. Anything else? Well, task force, I call you committee task force. I appreciate everybody's participation. We've got a lot done today. I knew this was going to be a lengthy meeting, but I appreciate your willingness to participate and engage us in discussion, Mr. Williams. And so now that you can go and prepare dinner for Mrs. Williams, I'm sure she will appreciate it. Anything else to come before the task force? Ms. Kennedy? Mr. Bradshaw? Anybody else have anything here in the chamber? Mr. Costa, any closing remarks? Ms. Kayser?
No, ma'am.
Without that, Our meeting stands adjourned. December 1, guys.